Ice-cold water splashed into his face and filled his mouth with salt. His body jerked involuntarily. Someone else's body, about 5 kilograms heavier. His hands were calloused, but not the right kind of calluses. Not from a machine gun or a cable. From a rope and an oar. He rolled onto his side and coughed so hard his ribs cracked. The planks beneath him were rotten and wet. Above his head dangled a tattered, askew sail rig that he hadn't even seen in museums. A sloop. No. Something halfway between a sloop and a fishing tub. The sail was full of holes. Heading toward the setting sun. Ethan Cross sat up and surveyed his surroundings with the eyes of a man who'd had one rule drummed into his head for 8 years. First, assess the situation. Then panic. 3 crew members, all armed with clubs. Everyone was looking not at him, but at the girl sitting on a pile of ropes on the starboard side. A soaked silk dress, a split lip, and completely dry eyes. He knew that look. He'd seen it in Kabul and in Manila. That's what people look like when they've given up hope. He had no weapon. All right, so we'll have to use our heads. He cleared his throat again and spoke to her hoarsely. He asked if she was his wife. The girl blinked. For the first time in many days, her lips twitched. She replied that she had been. Until yesterday morning, when they'd both been declared dead. Ethan nodded. Dead is dead. He looked again at the 3 men with clubs. The leader was broad-shouldered, with a jagged scar running across his cheek. He was eyeing the girl appraisingly, not as a person. More like cargo that's easier to throw overboard than to carry to its destination. Ethan stood up. His legs in this foreign body didn't obey him well, but he regained his balance on the rocking deck right away. 8 years on ships aren't forgotten. Even if the ship is different, the world is different, and you've most likely gone mad. He walked up to the broad-shouldered man and spoke calmly. He asked which of them was the captain and where they were headed. The broad-shouldered man spat overboard and replied that there was no captain here. There was an order. To take both of them to the Western Islands and forget they ever existed. Ethan nodded again. The Western Islands. He didn't know what that meant, but from the broad-shouldered man's tone, he understood enough. A place where people are sent to die. He turned to the girl. He asked her name. She looked at him strangely, as if she couldn't understand why a dead man would need to know a stranger's name. Then she answered. Selina Wyland. Ethan repeated the name aloud. He let it roll off his tongue. Then he asked how long it would take to reach the Western Islands. The broad-shouldered man grumbled that it would take 2 days if the wind didn't die down. Ethan looked at the sails. Full of holes. At the hull. Rotten. At the ropes. Worn down to the white. 2 days on this tub, that was optimism bordering on madness. But he said nothing. He sat down next to Selina, not right next to her but at arm's length. He asked quietly so the other 3 wouldn't hear. He asked who had ordered their deaths. Selina didn't turn her head. She answered with a single word. Family. Ethan processed that. Family. So they weren't enemies or pirates. Her own blood had decided to get rid of them. He'd seen things like this in his own world too. He'd seen generals write people off with a single stroke of a pen. But there, at least, they pretended it was for some greater cause. Here, they didn't even pretend. He asked why. Selina replied, for the land. Always for the land. Her father had died 6 months ago. He'd left her an inheritance. Someone wanted that inheritance more than they wanted her alive. That's why she'd been married off to a man with no name and no lineage, and man whose body Ethan now inhabited. And then both of them were declared dead and put on this boat. Ethan listened while keeping count. 3 men with clubs, 1 knife on the broad-shouldered man's belt, a sail that wouldn't withstand the first squall, a supply of water in a barrel by the mast, about 20 liters by his estimate, no food in sight, 2 days. He asked Selina if she knew how to swim. She looked at him as if he were crazy. She replied that she was a lord's daughter, not a fisherwoman. Ethan mentally translated that as no. So if the boat fell apart, and it would, he'd have to drag not only himself but her as well. Fine. He was used to that. In the Philippines, he'd dragged a 70-kilogram boatswain 200 meters through stormy surf. True, the man died afterward, but those were just details. Night fell quickly, without twilight. The sun dropped below the horizon as if someone had turned it off. The sky turned black and vast. The stars were unfamiliar. Not a single familiar constellation. Ethan stared at them for a long time. A minute, two. Then he looked away. Panic is a luxury. He couldn't afford it. Broad-shouldered and two others had settled at the bow. One was snoring. The other two were talking quietly. Ethan caught snippets of their conversation. They were discussing whether to wait until they reached the islands, or whether it would be easier to throw both of them overboard now and return sooner. One said that an order is an order. The other replied that they'd be paid just as much for the dead as for those delivered. Ethan quietly shifted closer to Selena. He whispered to her without turning around. He told her they were going to kill them before dawn. Selena didn't flinch. She replied that she'd known it from the very beginning. She pulled a thin bone hairpin, sharp as an awl, from the folds of her skirt. She said she intended to take at least one of them with her. Ethan looked at the hairpin. He looked at Selena. For the first time in this endless day, he almost smiled. He said the hairpin was good, but he had a better idea. He stood up. He walked over to the broad-shouldered man. The man tensed instantly and put his hand on his club. Ethan crouched down next to him and spoke calmly. He said the sails were full of holes, and if the wind picked up at night, the canvas would tear completely, and then they'd all be adrift in the middle of the ocean with no way to move forward. He said he knew how to mend sails. If they gave him a knife and a sail repair needle, he'd patch up the two biggest holes by morning. The broad-shouldered man stared at him for a long time. Then he asked why he wanted to do that. Ethan shrugged. He replied that he didn't want to drown, even if exile awaited him at the end of the journey. The broad-shouldered man thought for a moment. He exchanged glances with the other two. Then he nodded and tossed him the sail needle, but not the knife. Ethan didn't insist. He took the needle and climbed up the mast toward the sail. 4 meters up the wet wood in the pores on a rocking boat, the body was not his own, but his hands remembered the grip. Not his hands, the hands of this body's former owner. The calluses from the ropes were deep and old. This man had been climbing masts his whole life. Ethan reached the top yard and began to work. He wasn't mending the sail. He was studying the ship from above. He looked down at the deck by starlight. He memorized the layout. A water barrel by the mast. A chest at the stern. The helm tied with a rope to a cleat. 3 men below deck. 2 were dozing. 1 was sitting at the stern, gazing into the darkness. He worked for 2 hours. He patched 1 hole properly just to show he'd done the job. Then he went below deck. The broad-shouldered man checked the work by the light of a candle stub. He grunted. He said his hands weren't made of ass. Ethan sat down next to Selena and closed his eyes. But he didn't fall asleep. He was waiting. At 3 in the morning, he heard the broad-shouldered man quietly wake up the second one. They got up and walked toward the stern. Toward Selena. Ethan grabbed the first man by the ankle as he passed by. He yanked him. The man crashed face down onto the deck, knocked the wind out of himself. Ethan was on top of him before he could even take a breath. An elbow to the base of the skull. Not to kill, just to knock him out. The broad-shouldered man swung his club. Selena drove a hairpin into his thigh from behind. He howled and spun around to face her. Ethan struck him in the throat with the edge of his palm. The broad-shouldered man doubled over. Ethan wrenched the club from his grasp and brought it down on the back of his head. The man fell. The third man jumped up right in front of them. He saw the 2 men lying on the deck. He saw Ethan with the club. He saw Selena with the spike in her hand and blood on her fingers. He threw his club onto the deck and raised his hands. Ethan tied all 3 of them up with ropes. He checked the knots twice. He found the broad-shouldered man's knife. In a chest at the stern, he found dried meat and 3 water skins. They had been hiding the food. It would last 4 days if they rationed it. He walked over to the helm and looked at the stars. Unfamiliar constellations, but the principle was the same. The North Star, or whatever served as its substitute here. A bright white dot almost directly overhead. That meant they were far to the north, and the western islands were to the west. He caught the wind. He adjusted the sails. The boat creaked all over but began to move. Selena came over and stood beside him, silently, for a long time. Then she asked who he was. Not the man she'd been led to believe he was. Someone else. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't know how to answer that question himself. He said only one thing. He said he was the one who would bring this boat to shore. The rest could wait. Selena nodded. She accepted it. She knew how to accept what was given to her. She'd been taught that. Dawn broke 3 hours later, pink and cold. On the horizon lay that narrow strip of land. Islands. Ethan looked at them and thought. He wasn't thinking about where he came from or why he was here. He was thinking that on these islands, he needed fresh water. He needed a forest. He needed shelter. He needed people who knew how to work with their hands. And he needed time. He most likely didn't have any time. They reached the islands around noon. The first island was flat and barren. The second was overgrown with low shrubs and had no cove. The third was different. A high, rocky shore on one side, a forested slope on the other, and a narrow passage between two cliffs leading to a hidden cove. Ethan saw it and knew immediately. A natural harbor, sheltered from the wind and from prying eyes. He steered the boat into the passage. The cliffs closed in on either side so closely that you could reach out and touch them. Then they parted. The cove was small, about 150 meters across. Calm water, a sandy shore. And people were standing on the shore, about 13 of them. Ragged, thin, with faces bearing the same expression he'd seen on Selena's. They weren't waiting for rescue. They were waiting for the next disaster. The boat ran aground in the sand. Ethan jumped into the water, which came up to his knees. Cold. Clear. A freshwater stream flowed into the cove from the right. He noticed it right away. Fresh water. First item crossed off the list. Selena followed him into the water. She stood up straight, wet and battered, but with her back straight. An old man stepped out of the crowd, stooped, gray-haired, with hands gnarled like tree roots. He looked at Selena and bowed. He addressed her as, "Ma'am." He looked at Ethan and did not bow. He asked who he was. Selena answered for him. She said he was her husband. The old man looked at Ethan again, appraisingly, without hostility, but without trust either. He asked what he could do. Ethan looked around the shore. He looked at the people. He looked at the forest behind them. He replied that he could build boats. The old man snorted. He said they already had plenty of boats, until they were all smashed on the reefs. Ethan nodded. He said that was exactly why he would build different boats, ones that wouldn't crash into the reefs. The old man looked at him as if he were crazy. Ethan was already getting used to that. He walked past the crowd to the stream. He crouched down, cupped his hands to scoop up some water, tasted it. Clean, cold. So the spring must be somewhere higher up in the cliffs. It wouldn't dry up in the summer. He straightened up and looked at the island through the eyes of a marine. A cove, fresh water, a forest on the slope, a high bank for observation, a narrow passage that could be blocked by a single boat. This wasn't a place of exile. It was a fortress. He just had to find it. He turned to Selena. He told her he wouldn't be spending the night at the manor. She looked at him, puzzled. He explained. He said that if he wanted these people to listen to him, he had to sleep where they slept, eat what they ate, work the way they worked. Only then would they believe he wasn't just another lord who'd come to take what little they had left. Selena nodded silently. Something new flashed in her eyes. Not distrust, but curiosity. Ethan found a spot by the campfire next to the fisherman. He sat down on the ground, his back to the cliff, his face toward the sea, an old habit, always sitting so he could see the approaches. The fisherman eyed him warily but didn't chase him away. One held out a piece of smoked fish to him. Ethan took it. He thanked him. He ate it. The fish was tough and oversalted, but it was food. He sat by the fire and listens. He listened to the fishermen talking. He caught words, names, currents, reefs, winds. Every word was information. Every name was a point on the map he was drawing in his head. By midnight, he knew 3 things. First, there were 300 people on the island. Runaway serfs, impoverished fishermen, deserters from the royal fleet, 2 gangs of former pirates, and the remnants of Selena's family, the servants' relatives and those exiled along with her. Second, there was enough food to last a month barring a storm. Third, None of these people believed they would live to see spring. Ethan closed his eyes. For the first time in this endless day, he allowed himself to think about what had happened. He had died. The winch cable, the blow to the temple, the Philippine Sea. He remembered it. He remembered the cold of the water and the darkness. And then he found himself here, in a stranger's body, in a strange world, with a stranger's wife who was looking at him with dry eyes, waiting for him to turn out to be yet another man who would betray her. He opened his eyes. He looked at the stars. Strange. Beautiful. Completely useless for navigation until he learned them all over again. All right, he'd learned them. He'd always been a quick learner. The morning began with a shout. Ethan woke up instantly. His body jerked before his brain had even processed the sound. Two men were standing by the water, yelling at each other. One was a fisherman, and the other a former pirate. A dispute over a boat. The only intact boat on the entire island. The fisherman was shouting that it was his because he'd gotten there first. The pirate retorted that he didn't give a damn about who was first and that the strong take what they want. People were gathering around. The tension was mounting. Ethan saw hands reaching for sticks and stones. One fight, one dead body, and the island would be split in two forever. He stood up and walked toward the water. Not fast, not slow, with the calm stride of a man uninterested in others' hysteria. He stood between them. He looked at the boat. He looked at both of them. And he said that the boat didn't belong to anyone because it was junk. Both fell silent in surprise. Ethan crouched down by the boat and ran his hand along the bottom. He pointed it out. 3 planks rotten right through. The bulkhead was cracked. The keel was crooked. This boat would go out to sea and never return. Just like all the boats on which their people had perished. He stood up straight. He scanned the crowd. He said he would build a new boat, one that wouldn't crash into the reefs, wouldn't capsize in a storm, and wouldn't be swept sideways onto the rocks. But to do that, he needed help. 10 men for 3 weeks. Who would go? Silence. The fisherman and the pirate exchanged glances. Then the old man from last night stepped out of the crowd. The very same one, gray-haired, with gnarled hands. He said his name was Garen, that he'd been building boats for 40 years, and that if this stranger thought a boat that could sail against the reefs could be built in 3 weeks, he was a complete fool. But Garen would take a look, because a fool with a plan is better than a smart man without one. Ethan nodded. He asked Garen to show him the spot where his last boat had crashed. The old man's face darkened. The boat had crashed into the reef a month ago. His youngest son had drowned with it. Ethan didn't try to comfort him. Comfort doesn't fix anything. He said he wanted to understand why it had so that the new one wouldn't. Garen was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. They walked along the shore for 2 hours. Garen pointed things out. A reef ridge stretched along the entire southern shore. Underwater rocks, currents, whirlpools near the headlands. Ethan climbed the rocks with a homemade sounding line, a piece of rope with a stone at the end. He measured the depths. He memorized the contours of the seabed. By evening, he had a map in his head. Not an exact one, but good enough. He understood why boats wrecked here. 11 days. Ethan gave himself 11 days to build the first boat, and every morning he woke up thinking that wasn't nearly enough time. The first day was spent in the forest. He took Garen and 4 fishermen who had volunteered to help after the scene by the water and led them up the slope. It was a mixed forest. Softwoods for planking, hardwoods for the frames. Ethan didn't know the local names of the trees, but he knew how to test the wood. He cut off a splinter. He bent it. If it bends without breaking, it's for the planking. If it doesn't bend, it's for the frame. Garen watched this and grimaced. He'd been building boats for 40 years and knew every tree by name. And this outsider was poking at them with a knife like a doctor probing a patient. But the result was the same. Ethan was choosing the right trees, just using a different method. They felled 6 trunks on the first day, without a saw, with axes. Ethan cut his hands until they bled, because his unaccustomed body wasn't used to wielding an axe at the angle he was working at. But he didn't stop. In the evening, Selena came to the shore where they were hauling the logs. She brought water and flatbread. Ethan noticed that she had changed out of her silk dress into a simple canvas shirt and skirt. One of the women on the island had given her the clothes. Or maybe she'd asked for them. He didn't ask. She sat down next to him and watched as he drew in the sand. She asked what he was drawing. Ethan replied that it was a hull development, the shape of the boat if it were cut open and laid flat. Selena looked at the drawing closely. Then she said she had some paper, just a little. Her father always carried a supply of writing paper with him, and some of it had been preserved among the belongings she'd been allowed to take. Ethan looked at her. Paper. On this island, paper was more valuable than gold. He asked for 3 sheets. Selena brought 5. Ethan took a piece of charcoal from the fire and began to draw. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't neat. But it was precise. The hull lines, the placement of the frames, the spot for the centerboard, the mast mount, the boom, the sail. Garen looked over his shoulder and said nothing. Then he poked his finger at the drawing and said the frames were too thin. They'd break on the first wave. Ethan looked. He thought. Garen was right. He was used to plywood and fiberglass. Here there was only wood. They needed to be thicker. He redrew it. Garen pointed again. Here, the mast mount. If you set it up like that, the mast will rip through the deck at the first strong gust. The mount needs to extend all the way to the keel. Ethan nodded. He redrew it again. This was exactly why he needed Garen. Ethan knew the principles. Garen knew wood. Together they could build something neither of them could have built alone. On the second day, they began installing the keel, a long, straight log, stripped of bark and hewn smooth. Ethan marked it out, and Garen, along with the fishermen, began hewing it. The work was slow, painfully slow. Each frame had to be cut from a single piece of wood, shaped to fit the curve of the hull. Ethan showed the shape. Garen carved it into the wood. The fishermen hauled the hewn pieces ashore. By the end of the second day, they had the keel and 2 frames. They needed 12. On the third day, a problem arose. One of the 2 pirate gangs decided that the logs on the shore belonged to everyone, and that they had the right to take 3 logs for their own needs. Their leader, a burly man named Drake, approached Ethan in the morning and stated this as a fact. He didn't ask, he just stated it. Ethan looked at him. He looked at the 5 men behind him. All of them were armed with knives. Then he turned to Garen and asked how many logs they were short. Garen said 4. Ethan turned to Drake and offered a deal. 3 logs in exchange for 3 pairs of working hands for 2 days. Drake laughed. He asked why he should work for a stranger. Ethan replied calmly. He said that the boat he was building would be the first on the island capable of sailing against the wind. Whoever helps build it gets the right to use it for fishing, taking turns. Whoever doesn't help doesn't get to use it. Drake stopped laughing. He looked at his men. They were hungry. Everyone on the island was hungry. A boat that catches fish isn't a luxury, it's life. Drake spat. He said he'd give 2 men for 3 days. Ethan agreed. He didn't haggle. Every haggle takes time, and time was the one thing he didn't have at all. The days blurred into a streak of sweat and wood shavings. Ethan worked from dawn to dusk. Then he'd sit by the campfire and draw by the light of the flames. Garen sat beside him. They argued every evening. Garen said the planking should be tongue and groove, the way he'd done it his whole life. Ethan insisted on a smooth, flush-mounted hull because it offered less resistance to the water. Garen grumbled that nobody built boats that way. Ethan replied that that was exactly why all the boats here were slow. In the end, they reached a compromise. The bottom would be flush-mounted, the sides, clinker-built. Garen shook his head but went along with it. On the 5th day, Ethan ran into a problem he couldn't solve with his existing knowledge. The centerboard, the movable fin under the hull. He understood the principle, a board that slides down through a slot in the keel and locks into place. But a slot in the keel is a hole through which water pours in. It needs a seal. In his world, that meant rubber or silicone cord. There was neither here. He sat on the shore and looked at the unfinished hull. He thought. A girl of about 12 was pottering about nearby. Skinny, dirty, and silent. She'd shown up on the 2nd day and had been hanging around the boatyard ever since. She carried nails. She handed him tools. No one knew her name. She didn't say it herself. Ethan noticed she was chewing something. Resin. Pine resin from the pine trees on the hillside. He held out his hand. The girl flinched. Ethan didn't move. He waited. She looked at him. Slowly, she placed a piece of resin in his palm. Ethan rubbed it between his fingers. Sticky, dense, waterproof once it hardens. He looked at the girl and asked where she'd found it. She silently pointed up the slope. Ethan sent 2 fishermen to gather resin. By evening, he had half a bucket full. He mixed the resin with crushed charcoal and tow from old ropes. The result was a putty, thick and sticky. He caulked the keel slot with it. He waited through the night. By morning, the putty had hardened and wasn't letting any water through. Not perfect, but good enough. He turned to the girl who, as always, was sitting nearby and watching. He asked her name. She was silent. For a long time. Then she whispered, "Una." Ethan nodded. He said that starting today, she was his apprentice. Officially. Una didn't smile. But she stopped flinching when he reached out his hand. On the 6th day, Selena came with news. She had spent several days talking to the islanders, taking notes, counting. Now she knew everything. 312 people, 47 children, a 6-week supply of grain, a month's worth of dried fish. Fresh water wasn't a problem. The stream never ran dry. But food was a problem. A big problem. Without boats, there was no fishing. Without fishing, famine would set in 2 months. Ethan listened and nodded. Then he asked about the people from the Wayland house, those who had been exiled along with her. Selena replied, 12 people. Her father's old steward, 2 maids, a stable hand without horses, and 8 distant relatives who were sent here so they wouldn't interfere with the division of the inheritance. Ethan asked if there was anyone useful among them. Selena looked at him. A shadow of resentment flashed in her eyes. Then she replied calmly, "The steward knows commercial law by heart. One of the maids practices herbal medicine. The stable hand is actually a blacksmith who used to work with horseshoes but can work with other kinds of iron as well." Ethan mentally made a note of the blacksmith. A blacksmith means iron. Iron means tools. Tools are everything. He asked if there was any iron ore on the island. Selena didn't know. He went to see Garen. The old man said there were cliffs on the northern shore with rust-colored streaks. He'd always thought it was just dirt. Ethan asked to be shown the way. They walked for an hour. They found it. Brown iron ore. Not the best ore, but sufficient. Ethan stood at the mouth of the vein and did the math in his head. A smelter. The simplest furnace made of stones and clay. Bellows made of goat skins. Charcoal from the same trees that grew on the hillside. He could get iron. Poor quality iron. Porous. But iron nonetheless. From iron, nails. From nails, boats. From boats, fish. From fish, life. The chain was simple and unbreakable. He returned to the shipyard. The work continued. By the 8th day, the hull was ready. It stood on the shore like the skeleton of a huge fish. 12 frames. The keel. The plating was almost finished. Garen walked around and felt every joint. He grumbled. But he grumbled quietly. That meant he liked it. He would never admit it out loud. On the 9th day, they raised the mast. Ethan had been dreading this moment. The mast is a critical point. Too long and it will tip the boat on its side. Too short and the sail won't catch the wind. He carved the mast from the straightest log he could find. 5 meters. He planed it until it was smooth. He inserted it into the mount. He ran the shrouds from the top to the sides. He tightened them. The mast stood firm. It didn't sway. Garen felt the shrouds and, for the first time in all those days, gave an approving nod. On the 10th day, they sewed the sail. From the old canvas of the boat they'd arrived on. Ethan cut it out himself. Triangular. Lines. With 2 reefs to reduce the sail area in strong winds. The women of the island helped sew it. Selena was among them. She sewed neatly and quickly. Ethan noticed this. He thought that a lord's daughter who knew how to sew sailcloth was either an oddity or had a strong character. More likely the latter. Una carried needles and thread from one seamstress to another and memorized every stitch. On the 11th day, they launched the boat. It was a quiet morning. The wind was light. a southerly. The whole island had come out to watch. 300 people stood on the shore of the cove, in silence. Ethan pushed the boat off the shore. It glided into the water easily. It rocked slightly. It didn't take on any water. A good sign. He climbed inside. Garen followed him. Ethan lowered the centerboard. The board slid down through the slot in the keel. The sealant held. Not a drop of water. He hoisted the sail. The triangular sail caught the light breeze and billowed out. The boat began to move. Slowly, then faster. Ethan turned the tiller. The boat turned. Not like ordinary boats that creep sideways. It turned sharply, like a knife through water. Garen grabbed the gunwale. His face was white. Ethan steered the boat toward the exit from the cove, through a narrow passage between the rocks, out into the open sea. The wind picked up. The sail filled out. The boat took off. Fast, cutting through the waves with its sharp bow, with almost no list. The centerboard held it steady like a rail. Ethan could feel it in his hands, in the tiller, in every plank of the hull. It was working. His principles in Garen's hands. They had created something this world had never seen. He turned the boat around. Into the wind. Garen held his breath. The boat zigzagged. Tacking to the left, a turn. Tacking to the right, turn. Closer to the wind each time. Each time against the direction from which the wind was blowing. It was going where no other boat here could go. Ethan steered the boat back into the cove the same way he'd come out. A week had passed since Mira's descent, and the island had changed. Not outwardly, internally. People moved differently, faster, with purpose. Before, they'd wander along the shore like shadows. Now they walked like people who had a tomorrow. Ethan didn't celebrate. He was doing the math. One boat meant fish for 30 people. There were 312 on the island. They needed at least 6 boats. And that was just for fishing. They'd need more for defense, even more for trade. But first, fishing. First, food. He put Garen in charge of the slipway. He explained every step to him again, slowly, in detail. Garen grumbled that he wasn't a kid and that seeing it once was enough. But Ethan insisted. Not because he didn't trust Garen, but because if anything were to happen to Ethan, Garen had to be able to build a boat like that without him. It was a matter of principle. He had to pass on everything he knew. Otherwise, it would die with him. Garen began work on the second Mira. Ethan turned his attention to the blacksmith shop. Selena's blacksmith, whose name was Torin, turned out to be a man in his 40s with a quiet voice and enormous hands. He had been forging horseshoes for 20 years and knew nothing else. But his hands were just right and precise. Ethan explained to him what was needed. A smithy. The simplest furnace for smelting iron. Stones for the walls. Clay for plastering. Leather bellows. Torin listened and nodded. He didn't understand why they needed to build a furnace when they could just forge the iron they already had. Ethan showed him that the iron they had consisted of 5 rusty nails and 2 broken knives. 600 nails were needed for 6 boats, at least. Torin looked at the 5 nails. He looked at Ethan. He understood. They spent 3 days building the smelting furnace. Ethan demonstrated the shape, tall and narrow, with an opening for the bellows at the bottom and a chute for draining the molten metal. Torin laid the stones and coated them with clay. Una hauled clay from the bank of the stream in a wooden bucket. The bucket leaked. Una didn't complain. On the 4th day, they loaded the furnace. Ore from the north bank. Charcoal. Ethan knew the proportions roughly. Not exactly. Roughly. Torin pumped the bellows. The heat became so intense that it was impossible to stand nearby. Ethan stood there. He watched. He waited. After 4 hours, something began to flow from the chute. Not pure iron. Crude iron. A porous chunk of metal mixed with slag. Torin pulled it out with tongs. He placed it on a rock. He struck it with a hammer. Once, twice, 3 times. Sparks flew. The slag fell off in chunks. After 20 blows, iron remained. Poor quality. Soft. But iron. Torin turned it over in his hands. He looked at Ethan. and for the first time he smiled. He said it was workable. Ethan replied that he needed 50 nails by the end of the week. Torrin stopped smiling. Then he nodded. While Torrin was forging, Ethan set to work on something else. Lookout posts. The island was vulnerable. A hidden cove was good, but if the enemy approached unnoticed, the cove would become a trap. There was only one way out. A single boat could block it. They needed to spot the enemy long before he saw the island. Ethan took on 2 deserters from the Royal Navy. Their names were Vance and Kurt. Young men, 20 and 22. They had deserted the galleon after the captain beat a sailor half to death for stealing a piece of hardtack. They were frightened and quiet. They were used to every order being accompanied by a blow. Ethan didn't hit them. He didn't yell. He explained. He led them to the highest cape on the island, the western one. From there they could see the sea in 3 directions. The horizon lay flat and empty. Ethan pointed. This is where the outpost will be. A platform made of logs. A shelter from the rain. A 2-day supply of water and food. And a signal fire. Dry firewood stacked so it would catch fire from a single spark. White smoke meant a sail on the horizon. Black smoke meant danger. Vance asked, "What if it's just a merchant ship?" Ethan replied that any sail was a danger until proven otherwise. Vance nodded. He was the kind of person who was used to following orders. He just needed someone worth obeying. Ethan put them on 2-day shifts. 2 days on watch, 2 days off. He asked Garen to assign 2 more men to the second cape, the eastern one. Garen assigned them, without argument. Ever since Mira, Garen had done almost everything Ethan asked of him. Not out of blind obedience, out of respect for the results. Ethan returned to the shipyard and discovered a problem. Drake, the leader of one of the pirate gangs, had come back with a demand. This time it was more serious. His men wanted Mira, not just for a while, for good. Drake stood before Ethan, surrounded by 7 armed men, and said that the boat should belong to whoever was stronger. And on this island, he was the stronger one. Ethan looked at his few. Knives, clubs, 1 axe. He looked at Drake. Then he looked at Garen and the fishermen standing behind him. Unarmed. But there were more of them. And over the past 2 weeks, they'd learned to stand together. Ethan didn't make any threats. He didn't haggle. He said one thing. He said that the Mira was the first boat. There would be 5 more. And the 6th could be Drake's boat. His very own. With his name on the side. If he helped build it. If not, there would be no 6th boat, and Drake would sit on the shore and watch the others catch fish. Drake was silent. His men exchanged glances. Ethan added that once there were enough boats, they wouldn't just be able to fish. They'd be able to trade. Transport fish and wood to other islands. Trade them for things they don't have here. Grain, cloth, metal. Drake was a pirate, but he wasn't a fool. He understood the difference between stealing a single boat and owning one of his own forever. He spat, turned around and walked away. But the next morning, 2 of his men came to the shipyard and asked what to do. Ethan showed them. The second problem came at night. Ethan woke up to Una shaking his shoulder. Silently. She almost never spoke. But the shaking was urgent. He got up and followed her. Una led him to the edge of the forest. There, in the darkness, stood Selena with an oil lamp. A man lay nearby, young, covered in blood. Selena said the women had found him by the stream. He'd been swept away by the current. He was tied to a piece of a wrecked boat. Ethan crouched down beside him. He checked his breathing. Weak. Cuts on his arms and back. Not from rocks, from a knife. Someone had cut him and thrown him into the sea. Ethan called for Margot, Selena's maid who treated people with herbs. A large, quiet woman with red hands from constantly rubbing herbs. She came with a bag and got to work. She washed the wounds. She applied bandages made of moss and some kind of leaves. Ethan asked for water and made the wounded man drink. The man coughed. He opened his eyes. They were wild, frightened. He flinched. Ethan placed a hand on his chest and spoke calmly. He told him he was safe, that no one here would harm him. The man was breathing heavily. Then he began to speak. Quickly, disjointedly. He was a fisherman from the island of Karn, 2 days' sail to the north. The pirates had arrived yesterday morning. Captain Taze. Olgerd Taze. The young man uttered that name as if it were the name of the plague. Taze took everything. The boats. The food. He took 15 young men to row. Anyone who resisted was cut down. This guy resisted. They cut him down and threw him into the sea. The current carried him here. Ethan listened. The name. Olgerd Taze. He remembered it. He turned to Selena. He asked if she knew who that was. Selena nodded. Her face hardened. She replied that Taze was the most powerful pirate chieftain in the archipelago, a former officer in the Royal Navy. 10 ships, 200 or 300 men. He controls all the islands within 3 days' sail from here. Ethan took it all in. 10 ships. He had one boat. Not even a boat. A 7-meter-long centerboard boat. He looked at the wounded young man, then at Selena, then at the dark sea beyond the bay. He said they needed to pick up the pace. If Taze was operating within 2 days' sail of here, sooner or later he'd reach them too. And when that happened, they'd have to be ready to fight back. Selena asked how he planned to fight back against a pirate with 10 ships. Ethan replied, "Not with ships. With our wits." For the next 10 days, Ethan slept 4 hours a day. Garen built boats. Toran forged nails and shackles. Ethan did everything else. He set up a third lookout post on the southern cape. He organized a fishing watch. Mira went out to sea every day and returned with fish. 2 of the island's veteran fishermen mastered the controls in 3 days. Ethan wasn't surprised. They'd been fishermen their whole lives. All they needed was to be shown the new tool. Their hands remembered everything on their own. He began building rainwater cisterns, 3 large pits lined with stone and coated with the same mixture of resin and clay. Sloped wooden surfaces for collecting rainwater. Una helped. She now followed Ethan around like a shadow, silent, attentive. She remembered everything, people's names. The Wayland Company ship came into view and drifted to a halt half a mile from the shore. It didn't come any closer. It was waiting. Or perhaps it feared the reefs. Or it wanted to take a look around. Ethan stood on the headland and counted. 10 men on deck. Maybe another 5 or 6 below deck. An old-style sloop. 4 gun ports on each side. 8 cannons. Against that, Ethan had 3 unfinished boats and 12 men with axes. He turned to Selena. He asked what they wanted. Selena stood tall. The wind ruffled her hair. Her face was as hard as stone. She replied that they wanted one thing, to make sure she was dead. If she wasn't dead, then to finish the job. Ethan nodded. He asked who they might have sent. Selena thought for a moment. She replied that it was most likely her cousin, Marcus Wyland. The 3rd son of a collateral branch. Ambitious. Greedy. Not smart, but not stupid either. Cruel enough to carry out an order and cautious enough not to walk into a trap. Ethan mulled this over. Then he asked Selena directly. Did she want them to know she was alive? Selena was silent for a long time. Then she answered. She said no, not yet. If Marcus returned and reported that the island was empty and the exiles were dead, the House of Wayland would forget about this place. And a forgotten place is a safe place. Ethan agreed. They were on the same page, so they needed to hide. He went down from the cape and gave orders quickly and clearly, just like in the barracks, only without shouting. Everyone into the forest, behind the ridge of hills on the eastern side of the island. Women and children first. The men were to cover their tracks along the bay's shore, extinguish the campfires and cover them with sand. The boats, Mira and the second unfinished one, were in plain sight. He sent Mira to a hidden cove behind the reef ridge, the one he'd found during his first week. A narrow passage between the rocks, invisible from the sea. The unfinished boat couldn't be hidden. It was too heavy. Ethan ordered them to cover it with branches and seaweed. From a distance, it should look like a piece of wreckage washed ashore. They extinguished the forge. They covered the smelting furnace with stones and buried it under dirt. Una ran from group to group, relaying instructions. Silently, with gestures. She understood what was happening without any explanation. 2 hours later, the island looked deserted, as if no one had ever been there. Ethan checked the shore himself. He walked across the sand and wiped away his tracks with a branch. Not all of them. A shore that's too clean is suspicious. He left the old tracks and debris behind. He removed the fresh ones. Then he climbed up to the cape and waited. Selena was nearby, and Garen, and Drake. Drake had come on his own, without an invitation. He stood nearby, a knife in his hand, and stared at the ship. Ethan glanced at him. Drake didn't explain why he'd come. He didn't need to. He's a pirate. But he's a pirate who now lives on this island. And if the Wylans took or killed the islanders, Drake would be finished too. Their interests aligned. Ethan understood this and nodded to him. A rowboat was lowered from the ship. 6 men, armed with swords. One was well-dressed, presumably that very Marcus. The rowboat headed for the shore, not toward the cove. Toward the open shore on the south side. They didn't know about the cove. That was good. The rowboat ran aground in the sand. The 6 men got out. Marcus Wyland turned out to be young, about 25 years old. Thin, with thin lips and shifty eyes. He walked along the shore, looking around. His men spread out. 2 headed toward the forest. 2 walked along the shore. 2 stayed by the rowboat. Marcus stood there, waiting for a report. Ethan lay on the headland and watched. The 2 who'd gone toward the forest reached the tree line and stopped. They didn't venture inside. The forest was dense and dark, and they were afraid. Fine. The 2 walking along the shore went about 300 meters. They found the remains of an old campfire. They bent down. They looked. Ethan tensed up. But the fire pit was old. He'd left it there on purpose. The fresh fire pits had been covered up. They returned and reported to Marcus. Marcus walked along the shore for another hour. He found the wreckage of an old boat that Ethan had left in plain sight. He poked at them with his foot. He found an unfinished hull hidden beneath branches and seaweed. He looked at it. Ethan held his breath. Marcus bent down. He touched the wood. Then he straightened up and turned to his men. He said something. Ethan didn't hear the words, but he understood from the gesture. Marcus waved his hand dismissively. Trash. Debris. He wasn't interested in them. The unfinished hull, without plating or a mast, cluttered with seaweed, looked like junk washed up by a storm. Marcus and his men returned to the rowboat. They rowed away. They boarded the ship. Half an hour later, the launch hoisted its sails and headed east. Ethan waited another 3 hours. Then he came down from the cape. In the evening, when the men returned from the forest, he gathered them on the shore of the cove. He explained who had come and why. He didn't hide anything. These men deserved the truth. He said that the Wayland Corporation had been checking to see if Selena was dead. Now they think she is. That buys the island some time, but not indefinitely. Sooner or later, the truth will come out. And by that time, the island must be ready. The people listened in silence. Then one of the fishermen asked, "Ready for what?" Ethan replied, "Ready to not let anyone else in here without our permission." Drake snorted. He said, "Now that's a conversation." Ethan looked at him. He said that defending oneself isn't the same as looting. It's one thing to defend your home. It's another to attack someone else's. Drake shrugged. He didn't care what it was called. The main thing was that there would be a fight. Ethan didn't argue. As long as Drake was on his side, it didn't matter. He'd talk to him about the rules later, when he had something to back up his words with. The next 2 weeks were the hardest since they'd landed. Ethan divided the island into zones. The shipyard on the shore of the bay. The blacksmith shop higher up the slope. The residential area on a flat patch of land between the forest and the shore. Fields for planting. He found 3 plots with good soil and organized the planting. Not grain. There was no grain. Just tubers and roots that the local women gathered in the forest. They grew wild. Ethan suggested planting them in rows on the cleared plots. The women looked at him as if he were crazy. They'd been gathering these tubers in the forest their whole lives. The idea of planting them in the ground seemed absurd to them. Ethan asked for 1 plot. Just 1. To prove a point. If nothing grew in a month, he wouldn't push the issue any further. A month later, 3 times as much had grown as they'd gathered in the forest during the same period. After that, no one argued. He began building a smokehouse. There was plenty of fish, but it would spoil in 2 days. The smokehouse allowed them to store the fish for weeks. A simple design. A pit in the ground. A lattice of twigs. a fire of damp kindling that produced more smoke than heat. The first batch of smoked fish was tough and slightly bitter. The second batch was better. The third was already acceptable. Ayla O'Brien took charge of the smokehouse as if it were her own business. A large, red-haired woman with a loud voice and hands reddened from work. A widow. 2 sons. Boys aged 4 and 6 who ran around the island like wild goats. Ayla ran the only tavern on the island. It was only loosely called a tavern, a shed made of poles, 2 tables made of planks, a pot over the fire. She cooked soup from whatever she had on hand and fed everyone on credit, writing down on the wall in chalk how much each person owed. No one would ever pay. She knew that. She fed them anyway. Ethan started having dinner at Ayla's every evening. Not because the soup was good. It was because Ayla knew everything that was going on the island. Who had quarreled with whom? Who had fallen ill? Who was hoarding food? Who was crying at night? She was the intelligence source Ethan hadn't asked for but had received. He sat at her table, ate soup, and listened. Ayla talked a lot and fast. She told him that Drake's men were stealing nails from the shipyard, that one of the women was sick and Marga didn't know how to treat her, that the deserter Kurt was drinking some kind of homemade brew and getting violent, that old Vesna, a seer or a madwoman, was telling people that Ethan was a sorcerer and that his boats sailed on spells. Ethan listened to it all. Every point was a problem. Each problem had to be solved not by force, but in a way that wouldn't destroy the fragile thing he was building, the nails. He spoke with Drake, without accusations. He said the nails were disappearing. If it was his people, then they should return them. Not because Ethan was ordering it, because every stolen nail meant a day's delay for the new boat. And a new boat is Drake's boat. Drake is a boat bearing his name. The nails were returned the next day. A sick woman. Ethan asked Marg to describe her symptoms. Fever, cough, chest pain. It sounded like pneumonia. Ethan wasn't a doctor, but he knew the basics. Keep the patient warm. Give her hot drinks. If there's honey, give her honey. There was no honey. There was some kind of sweet tree sap that the locals collected from one of the trees. Marga tried it. The woman survived. Kurt and the brew. Ethan found Kurt in the morning after yet another drinking binge. The guy was lying by the stream with a battered face. He'd fallen on his own. Ethan sat down next to him and waited for him to come to. Then he said that if Kurt wanted to drink, that was his business. But if a drunk Kurt hit someone or broke something at the shipyard, Ethan would remove him from his post as a lookout and assign him to the dirtiest job on the island, cleaning out the latrines, every day, until he stopped drinking. Kurt looked at him with glassy eyes. Ethan spoke calmly, without anger, like a sergeant who'd given the same reprimand 1,000 times and had no interest in getting angry. Kurt didn't stop drinking, but he started drinking less often, and there were no more fights. Old Spring and the rumors of witchcraft, that was more complicated. Ethan couldn't explain to 300 people that a luffing sail was physics, not magic. Half of them didn't even know the word physics. He went to see Vesna, an old woman of about 60 with white eyes, half blind. She was sitting by her hut, muttering to herself. Ethan sat down beside her. He asked why she thought he was a sorcerer. Vesna replied that a boat sailing against the wind was sorcery, because the wind is the breath of the sea, and only someone who has made a pact with the sea can sail against the sea's breath. Ethan thought for a moment. Then he said he hadn't made a pact with the sea. He'd simply figured out how the wind works. Like a river. If you place a plank across the river, the water pushes it to the side. If you place it at an angle, the plank glides forward. It's the same with a sail and the wind. Vesna listened. Then she asked how he knew how the wind worked. Ethan replied that he'd been taught. Vesna asked who. Ethan paused. Then he said, "People who are no longer here." Vesna nodded. She said that in that case, he wasn't a sorcerer. He was a sorcerer's apprentice. Ethan decided that was close enough to the truth and didn't argue. The rumors didn't disappear, but they softened. Now they called him not a sorcerer, but an apprentice to sorcerers, which was almost a compliment. By the end of his second month on the island, Ethan had 4 boats in the water, Mira's and 3 new ones. Garin was building a fifth. Turan was forging. The fish were biting. The smokehouse was billowing smoke. The garden beds were turning green. The second month was drawing to a close when black smoke rose from the eastern cape. Ethan was at the shipyard when he saw it. Black, not white. Danger. He dropped his tools and ran. Vance was standing on the cape pointing. 3 sails on the horizon. Large ones. Sailing in formation. Not merchants. Merchants don't sail in formation. Ethan looked closer. 2 sloops and 1 brig. The brig was large. 30 meters. 12 gun ports. It was a force that 4 sloops couldn't contend with in open combat. Ethan came down from the cape and headed toward the cove, quickly, but he didn't run. A commander who runs is panicking. A commander walking quickly signals urgency. There's a difference. He found Garin at the shipyard. He explained. 3 ships from the east, most likely Teus, or his men. Garin turned pale. He asked what to do. Ethan replied, "Don't hide. Hiding won't work this time. 3 ships mean a reconnaissance in force. They're not coming to scout, they're coming to take us." Ethan gathered his men. Not everyone, just those who could fight and those who could row. 22 men. Deserting fishermen and Drake's men. Drake came himself, armed with a knife and an axe. His eyes were ablaze. He'd been waiting for this. Ethan explained the plan, quickly, simply. They wouldn't head out to the open sea. 3 ships would crush them in half an hour. They'd wait in the shallows, the reef ridge along the southern shore. That very labyrinth of underwater rocks where Garin's son had perished. Boats, with their movable keels, can navigate the shallows where larger ships would run aground. The plan was simple. Lure them in. Lead them to the reefs. Let them try to give chase. Drake snorted. He said that wasn't a plan. It's suicide. If they don't take the bait, they'll just shell the island from a safe distance. Ethan nodded. He said that's exactly why they wouldn't wait. They'd go out to meet them. They'd show themselves. Let themselves be seen. And then they'd run. Running from pirates is an invitation to a chase. Pirates can't help but chase prey that's running away. It's instinct. Drake looked at Ethan for a long time. Then he nodded. He was a pirate. He knew Ethan was right. Chasing fleeing prey is something pirates can't control. 4 boats left the cove through a narrow passage. Ethan was on the Mira. Garin stayed on shore. Ethan wouldn't let him go. The old man was needed at the shipyard, not in battle. Garin argued. He shouted that these were his boats, and he'd sail them even to the Sea Devil himself. Ethan replied that if he died, no one else would build the boats, and that Garin knew that. Garin fell silent. He knew. 4 longboats rounded the island and headed for the eastern shore. 3 pirate ships were already close. 2 sloops were in the lead. A brig followed behind. Ethan hoisted a piece of red cloth up the mast. Not a flag, just a rag. But bright. Visible. It said one thing. "We're here. You can see us." The pirates saw it. The lead sloop changed course. It turned toward them. The second followed. The brig was slower. It was heavy. Ethan turned the boats around and set off. The 4 dinghies raced south toward the reefs. The pirates were right behind them. The distance was closing slowly. The dinghies were fast. Faster than the sloops. But the sloops were sailing under full sail, and the wind was at their backs. Ethan led the Mira in the front. 3 boats followed him. He knew these reefs. Over the past month, he had studied every rock, every current, every shoal. The pirates didn't know them. He led them to the southern shore. The reef ridge began half a mile from the shore. Submerged rocks, whirlpools, narrow passages between the cliffs. For a centerboard boat with its centerboard up, it was a road. For a schooner with a deep draft, it was a wall. Ethan dove into the first passage. He raised the centerboard in the shallows. The boat slithered between the rocks like a snake. A second centerboard boat followed him. A third, a fourth. The lead pirate sloop didn't have time to brake. It crashed into the rocks at full speed. The crack could be heard even above the roar of the wind. The hull was ripped open by a jagged gash from bow to midship. The sloop listed to one side. The crew tumbled into the water. The second sloop saw this and tried to turn away. It managed to do so but lost speed. It came to a drift next to the reefs, unable to move forward or backward. The current was pulling it toward the rocks. The brig. The brig came to a stop. Its captain was no fool. He saw what had happened to the first sloop. He drifted half a mile from the reefs and waited. Ethan stood on the deck of the Mira in the shallows beyond the reefs and watched the brig. 12 gun ports. Each cannon could reach him at that distance, but not accurately. The pitching, the wind, and the reefs between them. A cannonball hitting a dinghy in shallow water among the rocks would be an incredible stroke of luck. The brig didn't fire. It waited. Ethan waited too. The minutes dragged on. The people from the wrecked sloop were floundering in the water. Some were clinging to the rocks. Some were swimming toward the second sloop. Ethan saw them and made a decision that would later determine everything. He turned around 2 longboats and sent them toward the drowning men. Not to finish them off, to pull them out. Drake, in the second longboat, stared at him as if he were mad. Ethan shouted one word to him. "Alive!" Drake spat into the water, but he obeyed. They pulled 14 men out of the water, soaked, terrified. Half of them were wounded. One was unconscious. Ethan ordered them to be taken ashore. Tie them up, but don't maim them. Give them water. The brig watched. It didn't fire. Its captain saw that his men were being pulled from the water rather than finished off. That was information. Information that would eventually reach Tice. That was exactly what Ethan was counting on. An hour later, the brig hoisted its sails and sailed east, taking the second sloop in tow. One sloop lay wrecked on the reefs, slowly sinking. 14 prisoners were on the shore. Ethan sat down on the sand next to Mira and allowed himself 10 minutes to think of nothing. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline pouring out of his body like water from a punctured barrel. Selena sat down beside him. She had been standing on the cape and had seen everything. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. She asked what he was going to do with the prisoners. Ethan replied, "Let them go." Selena looked at him, not with surprise, but with calculation. She asked why. Ethan explained, saying that dead prisoners were revenge. Revenge begets revenge. Tice will come with 10 ships, not 3. Alive prisoners released unharmed. That's the message. A message that says one thing. We are not enemies. We are defending ourselves. Those who want peace will find peace. Those who want war will find reefs. Selena thought it over. She nodded. She said he was thinking like a politician, not a soldier. Ethan replied that a good sergeant is always a bit of a politician, just without a tie. He treated the prisoners. Marga bandaged the wounded. Ethan spoke with each one, asking their names, where they were from, how long they'd been with Tice. The answers were similar. Fishermen and former sailors. Most had ended up with Tice against their will. Their villages had been raided. The choice was simple. Row to Tice or drown. Ethan listened and thought. These people weren't enemies. They were just as broken as those who already lived on his island. 2 days later, he put all 14 of them in a boat. He gave them water and dried fish for 3 days, and he told them one thing they were to pass on to Tice and everyone else. He said he wasn't at war with the fishermen. Whoever wanted to work was welcome to come. There were boats here. There was food. There was room. The captives looked at him, 14 pairs of eyes, wet, confused. Then one nodded, then another. They sailed away. Ethan watched the boat head east and thought that he had either done the smartest thing of his life or the stupidest. A week later, a small fishing boat approached the island. There were 8 people on board. One of them was one of those 14 captives. He had brought 7 others with him. 4 former pirates from Tice who wanted to leave, and 3 fishermen from Carn Island, the same island from which the wounded young man they'd picked up a month ago had fled. They had come to work. Ethan accepted them. He didn't ask about their past. He didn't demand oaths. He set one condition. Whoever lives on the island works. Whoever works eats. Whoever steals or fights leaves. That's it. The 8 men agreed. Drake watched this with a wry smirk. Then he walked up to Ethan and said that he was either a genius or, in a month, there would be 500 people on this island and nothing to feed them. Ethan replied that that was exactly why he needed the 6th boat, that very one, with Drake's name on board. Drake fell silent. Then he nodded and walked off to the shipyard. Without an order, without a request. Ethan stood and watched him go. A small victory. One of many he needed every day. Small victories that add up to something big. If there was enough time. That evening, Ethan went to see Isla. He sat down at his usual table. Isla set a bowl of soup in front of him and sat down across from him. Her boys were sleeping in the corner, curled up like puppies. Isla said she'd heard about the fight, about how he'd pulled the pirates out of the water instead of letting them drown. She asked why. Ethan looked into the bowl. The soup was cloudy and watery. He replied that dead pirates are just corpses. The living pirates you saved are the ones who'll remember and tell others. Isla was silent for a moment. Then she said that her husband had thought the same way. He too couldn't just sail past a drowning person. That's why he drowned, because he went to rescue someone else's boat in a storm. Ethan didn't know what to say. He remained silent. Ayla wasn't offended. She got up and brought him some more soup. That's how she took care of him. Without words, without explanations, just another bowl of soup. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat on the shore of the cove and stared at the water. He thought about Thaisa. The brig was gone, but it would return. And not alone. Ethan had lost 1 sloop and 14 men to Thaisa. For a pirate chieftain, that's no small matter. It was an insult. And an insulted pirate is more dangerous than a hungry one. He needed time. A month. 2. To build more boats, to train his men, to fortify the cove. But time was running out. He could feel it. Just as he could sense an approaching storm an hour before the first clouds appeared. Someone approached him. Quiet footsteps on the sand. Ethan didn't turn around. He knew from the sound of the footsteps. Una. She sat down beside him in silence. She held out a piece of smoked fish to him. Ethan took it, chewed, looked at her. Una was 12 or 13. Even she didn't know for sure. She didn't remember her parents. Didn't remember home. The first thing she remembered was the harbor. Big, noisy, and hunger. Ethan didn't ask for details. Instead, he asked how many nails Torn had made in the last 3 days. Una answered instantly. 74. 6 of them were defective. Ethan nodded. He asked how many planking boards had been prepared for the 5th. Una answered. 18 out of the 24 needed. Ethan asked who was on duty today at the Western Cape. Una answered. Kurt. His shift ends at dawn. Ethan looked at her. This girl remembered everything. Absolutely everything that happened on the island. Every number, every name, every fact. He didn't understand how it worked, but he understood its value. Una was his living journal, his memory, his staff sergeant in the body of a child who carried nails and slept under a canopy. He told her that starting tomorrow, she would no longer have to carry nails. Una looked at him in fear. She thought she was being kicked out. Ethan shook his head. He said she would count, write down, memorize. Everything that comes to the island, everything that leaves the island, everything that's built, and everything that breaks. She would be his eyes where he wasn't. The 3rd month on the island began with rain. It wasn't a light rain. A wall of water crashed down from the sky and didn't stop for 3 days. The stream swelled and flooded the lower part of the shore. 2 huts were washed away. The blacksmith shop was flooded up to the knees. Toran stood in the water, holding the bellows above his head, his face that of a man whose child is being killed. Ethan organized the move of the blacksmith shop higher up the slope in 4 hours. In the downpour, without complaint, people hauled stones and clay up the slippery trail, and no one asked why. 2 months ago, they would have sat in their huts and waited for the rain to stop. Now they were working. The rain filled the water cisterns that Ethan had built during the 1st month. All 3 of them, to the brim. A 2-month supply of fresh water without a single drop from the stream. Ethan looked at the full cisterns and thought that sometimes a disaster is a gift if you're ready for it. On the 4th day, the rain stopped. The sun came out and the island was shrouded in mist. Steam rose from the wet ground, the wet trees, and the wet people. Ethan stood on the shipyard and assessed the damage. The 5th boat on the slipway was unharmed. The hull had been covered with a canvas tarp they'd stretched over it before the storm. Garen had done his best. The old man knew storms better than Ethan did. Blake's 6th boat had lost 2 bulkheads, which had been washed away. A day's work, bearable. But the main problem wasn't at the shipyard. The main problem was sitting in Ayla's tavern, coughing. 17 people had come down with it after 3 days in the rain. Fever, coughing, aching bodies. Marga ran from one to the next with herbs and hot decoctions. Ethan helped, not as a doctor, as an orderly. He brought water. He boiled it. He made them drink. He made them lie in the warmth instead of on the wet ground. 3 were in serious condition, an old man and 2 children. Ethan sat by their sides all night, not because he could do anything, because someone has to be there for the sick. That's what he did from the barracks. A sick person left alone gives up faster. The old man survived. So did the children. Marga said her ointment made from pine resin and mountain moss had helped. Ethan suspected it was the warmth and clean water that had helped, but he didn't argue. After the storm, he gathered the people and announced new rules. Latrines must be farther from the stream. Only boiled water is to be drunk. Food must be stored on raised platforms, not on the ground. Hands must be washed before eating. The last rule sparked more debate than all the others combined. A fisherman named Olin asked why they should wash their hands if they'd just get dirty again in a minute. Ethan replied that dirty hands spread disease from one person to another. That disease isn't a curse or a punishment, but rather tiny creatures that live in dirt and get inside through food. Olin looked at him as if he were crazy. Tiny creatures in the dirt. Vesna muttered that this proved he was a sorcerer's apprentice. Ethan sighed. He said it didn't matter whether they believed him or not. Rules are rules. Anyone who doesn't wash their hands doesn't eat in the communal dining hall. That's it. A week later, everyone was washing their hands. Not because they believed in the tiny creatures, but because Isla refused to serve soup to anyone with dirty hands. And Isla's soup was the only hot meal on the island. The second week of the 3rd month brought visitors, not enemies, merchants. A small merchant ship approached the island from the south. The captain was a fat, bearded man named Renard. He traded among the islands of the archipelago and knew every cove within a 2-week sail. He'd come in for water and was ready to pay with grain. Ethan met him on the shore. He offered water for free. Renard was surprised. Nothing was ever free in these waters. Ethan explained. The water was free. But if Captain Renard needed repairs, the Hafenrest shipyard could patch the hull and replace the rigging for a fee. Renard looked at the shipyard. 4 slipways. Well, almost 4. 2 proper ones and 2 makeshift ones. 6 boats at the dock. A smithy was smoking on the hillside. People were working. He'd been a merchant for 30 years and knew what a place with a future looked like. He agreed to some minor repairs. A cracked bowsprit, half a day's work. Ethan put Garen in charge. Garen fixed the bowsprit in 4 hours, and Renard paid with a sack of barley and 2 coils of good rope. Rope. Ethan held it in his hands and almost kissed it. Good hemp rope. Not the rotten ropes they twisted from local plants. Real rope. You could make rigging for 2 dinghies out of it. Before setting sail, Renard sat with Isla and drank soup. Ethan sat down next to them. They talked. Ethan didn't ask direct questions. He listened. Renard spoke of his own accord. About fish prices on the mainland. About how grain prices had doubled in a year. About how the great families had raised port duties in the capital to extortionate levels. About how small merchants like him were barely making ends meet. Ethan listened and took it all in. Every figure, every route, every complaint. It was a map. Not a geographical one, an economic one. And on that map he saw a gap. Duties in the capital were suffocating small traders. If Hafenrest offered low duties or no duties at all, the merchants would come here. Not out of love, out of profit. And profit is more reliable than love. He spoke with Selena that evening. He shared his idea. Selena listened. Her eyes narrowed. Not out of suspicion. Out of calculation. She was the daughter of a trading house. She understood money the way Ethan understood the tides. She said the idea was good but premature. They had neither docks nor warehouses nor contracts. Not a single document that would make Hafenrest a legal trading post. Any merchant who came here would be trading at their own risk. And in these waters, fear is more costly than risk. Ethan nodded. He asked what was needed. Selena held up her fingers. A dock for ships with a draft of more than a meter. A warehouse, scales, a written charter of trade, and a seal. The community's seal confirming that Hafenrest was not a pirate's den but a trading settlement with rules. Ethan looked at her. He asked if she could arrange all of that. Selena looked at him. For the first time in all these weeks, something resembling a fire appeared in her eyes. Not joy, not hope, excitement. The excitement of someone who, for the first time, had been given the chance to do what she does best. She replied that she could, if he gave her Randall to handle the paperwork, Torin to handle the seal, and one boat once a week to transport samples of fish and smoked meats to the neighboring islands. Ethan agreed. While Selena was building her trade, Ethan was building a fleet. The 5th boat was launched. The 6th followed. Drake's boat. Ethan kept his word. A name was carved on the hull. Drake stood on the shore and stared at the letters. His expression was strange. Ethan couldn't read it. Then Drake turned and walked away, in silence. But that evening, for the first time, he came to Isla's and sat down at the table like everyone else. Not apart from the others. Right alongside the fishermen. He didn't become a good person overnight, but he had become a man who owned a boat bearing his name. And that changed something inside him. Ethan didn't know exactly what, but he saw the result. Drake's men stopped carrying knives out in public. Ethan began building the 7th and 8th boats at the same time. 2 slipways were operating in parallel. Garen supervised one. Ethan put Olin in charge of the other, the very same fisherman who didn't want to wash his hands. Olin turned out to be a quick learner. His hands knew the wood. His mind worked fast. Within a week, he'd mastered a new type of planking and started teaching the others. Ethan watched this and thought about the scale of it all. The navigator arrived in chains. The 4th month began when a fishing boat carrying 3 men and 1 woman approached the island. The woman was tied to the mast. The men were former pirates from Tice. They had deserted a week earlier and taken a captive with them, not out of pity, but out of calculation. They'd had heard that Hoffenrest took in people who came with something valuable. The captive was valuable. Ethan stood on the shore and watched as they untied her from the mast. Young, about 22 years old, high cheekbones, dark, angry eyes. Her hands were scarred from the rope. She didn't ask for help. She didn't cry. She looked at her captors with an expression that promised them death at the first opportunity. One of the deserters explained. He said her name was Mei Chion, that she had been a navigator on Tice's flagship, the best navigator in the archipelago. She reads the stars like a book. She knows every current from the western islands to the mainland. Tice kept her in chains because she had tried to escape 3 times. Ethan looked at Mei. She looked at him, without fear, with contempt. She saw yet another man who would decide she belonged to him simply because he was stronger. Ethan turned to the deserters. He spoke calmly. He said there were no slaves on Hoffenrest. No one belongs to anyone. If they brought her here as merchandise, let them take her back and get out. If as a human being, let them untie her. Now. The deserters exchanged glances. One started to say that she was dangerous and that if they untied her, she'd kill someone. Ethan repeated himself. Untie her. Now. His tone was the very one that made the rank and file to move before their brains could process the words. The deserter untied her. Mei rubbed her wrists. She looked out at the sea, at the boat, then at Ethan. She asked hoarsely. She asked what he wanted from her. Ethan replied, nothing. She's free. She can leave whenever and wherever she wants. But if she has nowhere to go, there's food and work on the island. Mei looked at him. She was looking for a trap, looking for a catch. She was used to every offer coming with a price, and the price was always the same. Ethan saw it in her eyes, and it made him sick. Not because of her, because of the world that had made her this way. He turned away and walked toward the shipyard. He didn't look back. Let her decide for herself. Mei didn't leave. For 3 days, she sat on the shore and looked out at the sea. She didn't speak to anyone. She ate what Yuna brought her. Yuna brought it in silence. She'd set the bowl down nearby and leave. 2 silent girls. One 12 years old, the other 22. Both were broken. Both had eyes that had seen too much. On the 4th day, Mei came to the shipyard. She stood by the slipway and watched Ethan work on the 8th boat, for a long time. Then she said his boats were ugly. Ethan looked up. She stood with her arms crossed, staring at the hull with an expression of professional disdain. She said the bow was too wide, that the lines were rough, that a hull like that would pound against the waves like a hammer on an anvil. Ethan straightened up. He looked at the hull, then at her. He asked how she knew. Mayri replied that before she was sold to pirates at 14, she'd grown up at a shipyard. Her father built boats. Not like these, long ones, narrow ones, with lines that cut through the waves rather than fought against them. Ethan looked at her and thought. Then he handed her a chisel. "Show me," he said. Mayri took the chisel. She walked over to the bow of the hull and began to carve. Thin, even shavings flew off. She worked quickly and precisely. An hour later, the bow was transformed. Sharper, smoother, with lines that flowed like water. Garen walked over and watched, silently. Then he said that this girl's hands were better than those of half his students over the past 40 years. Mayri didn't turn around, but her shoulders relaxed by a fraction of an inch. Ethan offered her a job at the shipyard. He didn't order her, he offered. Mayri replied that she'd be bored at the shipyard, but if he had any maps, she'd take a look. He didn't have any maps. He had sketches he'd made based on fishermen's stories and his own observations from the headlands. Mayri looked at them and grimaced. She said they weren't maps but children's drawings. Then she sat down and, in 2 days, drew a map of the archipelago from memory. 60 islands, currents, depths, reefs, shoals, passes, seasonal wind routes. Ethan looked at this map and realized he was holding a treasure in his hands. Not gold, better than gold, information. With this map, his boats could navigate between the islands not blindly, but along set routes. Bypass reefs, use the currents, shorten the journey. He asked Mayri how she knew all this. She replied briefly, 10 years at sea, 4 years as a navigator for Thais. When you're beaten for every mistake, you quickly stop making mistakes. Ethan nodded. He didn't ask any further questions. A week later, he gave her her first assignment, to take the centerboard from Hafenrest to Cairn Island and back. A 2-day voyage. To test her route and practice, Mayri took the boat and left. She returned in 1 day and 8 hours, 4 hours faster than Ethan had expected. She'd found a current that wasn't marked on her own chart. She updated the chart that very evening. Ethan looked at her and thought that this woman was worth 10 boats. Because 10 boats without a navigator are 10 boats that will get lost. But 1 boat with a good navigator is a ship that will arrive where it's supposed to. Midway through the 4th month, the first real test of their trade, Selena sent Mira to Cairn Island with a cargo of smoked fish and fresh water in barrels. Mayri was in charge. The fishermen of Cairn greeted them warily. But the fish was good and the water was clean. They traded it for goat's milk and dried fruit. Goat's milk. Ethan tasted it and almost cried. Not because of the taste, but because, for the first time on his island, a product had appeared that they hadn't produced themselves. Trade was working. Hafenrest was no longer a closed circle. It had begun to breathe. Selena drafted Hafenrest's first trade charter. It took 45 days to build the schooner. Ethan remembered each day separately because every day brought a new problem. On the 3rd day, bulkhead number 4 burst. The wood turned out to have internal rot that wasn't visible from the outside. Garen cursed for half the day. Ethan silently cut down a new log and began hewing it anew. On the 8th day, they ran out of nails. Torin had mined all the ore from the nearest section of the vein. They had to dig deeper into the rock. Ethan organized a crew of 6 men. They chiseled away at the rock for 2 days. The ore started coming out. It was poor quality, with a high proportion of waste rock. But they were getting ore. On the 12th day, Mayri grabbed Ethan's hand as he was shaping the mast and told him he was doing it wrong. A schooner's mast should not be round but slightly oval in cross-section. That way, it better resists bending from the sail. Ethan looked at her. He looked at the mast. She was right. He replaned it. On the 20th day, Hannah Ryu arrived. It was unexpected. A small merchant sloop from Valancourt had called at Hafenrest to take on water. Among the sailors was a thin, 19-year-old girl with short-cropped hair and fierce eyes. She had stowed away. She'd hidden in the hold of a Valancourt merchant ship 3 weeks ago and had transferred from there to this barge. The barge's captain had discovered her yesterday and was planning to set her ashore at the first available port. Hafenrest turned out to be the first. Ethan stood on the pier and watched as she hopped ashore with a sack on her back. The sack was heavy. She dragged it with difficulty but didn't let go. Ethan asked what was in the sack. Hannah looked at him appraisingly. Then she opened it. Inside were tools, drill bits, templates, a set square, a compass, and blueprints. 24 blueprints on thin paper, rolled into tubes. Ship blueprints. Ethan took one, unrolled it, and froze. These were just blueprints. These were blueprints for a new type of Valancourt ship, the very ones that were squeezing out Asterian trade. Oblique sails, streamlined hulls, retractable keels. Things Ethan knew in principle from his own world, but saw here brought to life by others' hands. He asked where they came from. Hannah replied briefly, "My father. He was a master craftsman in Valancourt, one of the best. He designed these ships, but he wouldn't let her pass the workshop threshold, because she was a daughter, not a son. She stole the blueprints and ran away." Ethan looked at her. 19 years old. She'd stolen her father's life's work and fled to the other side of the world. Not out of spite, out of desperation, because the only thing she knew how to do and loved was forbidden to her for a reason beyond her control. He brought her to the shipyard. He showed her the unfinished schooner. Hannah walked around it. She touched every frame. She tapped the hull plating. She crouched by the keel and ran her finger along the line. Then she stood up and said the schooner was good. But the stern's contours could be improved, and she pointed out exactly how on her father's drawing. Ethan looked at it. Then he looked at his own drawing, then back at hers. She was right. The stern in his drawing was rough, flat. The stern in the Valancourt drawing flowed like water, smoothly, without resistance. The difference in speed could be 10%. 10% at sea is the difference between life and death. He handed her a chisel, told her to get to work. Hannah worked. From that morning until the end. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't ask for anything. She just picked up the tool and worked. Her hands were precise and quick. She understood Ethan's drawings before he had even finished sketching them. She saw a line on the paper and transferred it to the wood without needing any explanation. Garen watched her and shook his head. Not out of disapproval, out of amazed. He'd been teaching apprentices for 40 years. Not a single one had picked it up so quickly. Mayri and Hannah bumped into each other on the second day, literally. Mayri was carrying a map to the shipyard. Hannah was hauling a plank. They collided at the slipway. Mayri dropped the map. Hannah dropped the plank. They both stared at each other. Two young women with fierce eyes and troubled pasts. Ree asked who she was. Hannah asked the same thing. Ethan stood nearby, waiting. They could become friends. They could come to hate each other. They could just ignore each other. Hannah looked at the map that Mayri had dropped. She bent down, picked it up, looked at it closely. Then she said that the current off Carn Island was drawn incorrectly. It flows not north but northeast. She'd seen it when she sailed past. Mayri took the map. She looked at Hannah, then at the map, then back at Hannah. She said she'd check it. If the girl was right, she'd correct it. If not, she shouldn't meddle with other people's maps. Hannah shrugged. She didn't care either way. She'd already walked back to the slipway. Mayri checked it. Hannah was right. Mayri corrected the chart and never spoke of Hannah with disdain again. Not friendship, but professional recognition. For both of them, that was more valuable than friendship. The schooner was taking shape. The hull, the deck, the cabin, the hold. 2 masts. Ethan worked on the rigging. Hannah on the hull lines. Garen on the fastenings. Torin forged the staples and loops. Mayri calculated the sail area based on wind data she'd been collecting for months. Una counted every nail, every plank, every hour of work. Selena handled the bookkeeping and correspondence with the merchants, who had begun calling at Hafenrest once every 2 weeks. On the 30th day of construction, Ethan came to see Selena in the evening. They sat in her room, small, clean, with a single table and 2 chairs. They lived in the same house but in different rooms. It had been that way from day one. Ethan didn't impose himself. Selena didn't invite him in. The boundary was thin but unbreakable. That evening, Ethan came with a drawing, but not of a ship, of a trade route. He spread out the map of Mayri on the table and pointed it out. 3 routes: Hafenrest and Carn Island, Hafenrest and Vern Island to the south, Hafenrest and the neutral port of 3 lighthouses halfway to the mainland. 3 routes, 3 types of cargo: fish, wood, Water. Selena looked at it. Then she began asking questions. Hold capacity, travel time, food and water consumption for the crew, the cost of goods on each island. Markup, Ethan answered. For half the questions, he didn't know the exact figures. Selena took notes. Where there were no figures, she put a question mark and wrote next to it how to find out. The schooner was launched on the 45th day. 12 meters of beautiful wood stood at the dock, rocking gently on the shallow waves. 2 gaff sails, a deck, a cabin with 2 berths, a hold capable of carrying 1 metric ton of cargo. Ethan stood there looking at it, thinking that this was the first real vessel he had built in this world. Centerboard boats were boats. Good boats, but still just boats. The Silent Selene was a ship. A small one, but a ship nonetheless. Mayrie took her on her maiden voyage to Carn Island and back. Hannah went with her, not as a navigator, but as an observer. She wanted to see how the hull behaved in the waves, to see the curves of the stern she'd carved, to feel whether they worked. They returned a day and a half later, 4 hours faster than it took Mira to travel the same route. Mayrie went ashore and said one word. It flies. Hannah followed her ashore and said nothing, but her face said it all. She had built a ship, the first one of her life, and it flew. Trade was underway. Selena sent the quiet Selena out on voyages every week. Smoked fish, fresh water, lumber. On the return trip, they carried grain, fabric, salt, goats, live goats. Selena bought 4 goats on Vern Island and brought them back in the hold. Ethan watched the goats come down the gangplank and thought his life had taken on a surreal twist. A U.S. Marine Corps staff sergeant watching goats being unloaded from a sailboat in a medieval port on an island in another world. Normal. The goats provided milk. The milk provided protein that the children desperately needed. 47 children on the island. Ethan knew that number by heart. Every morning when he walked to the shipyard, he passed by the playground where the children played. He counted their heads. 47. All alive. All more or less healthy. That was more important than any ship. The 5th month brought 2 events, one good and one bad. The good news came first. The merchant Renard, who now stopped by regularly, brought another merchant with him, a man named Victor Halls, a major trader from the neutral port of 3 lighthouses. Halls was a tall, lean man, with a sharp nose and eyes that took in everything they looked at. He had come to see the shipyard that was the subject of rumors. Ethan personally showed him around Hafenrest. The shipyard, the forge, the smokehouse, the warehouse, the pier they had expanded last month, 4 slipways, 10 sloops in the water, 1 schooner, a second on the slipway. Halls watched in silence. He was weighing his options. Then he sat down with Isla, drank a bowl of soup, and made an offer. He was ready to bring iron to Hafenrest, good iron from the mainland, not ore but finished ingots, in exchange for 2 things. First, repairs to his ships at the shipyard at a discounted rate. Second, the right of first refusal on fish and timber from Hafenrest. Ethan looked at Selena. Selena looked at Halls. Negotiations began. Real ones, with numbers and terms. Ethan didn't participate. He sat off to the side and listened. Selena haggled, toughly, calmly, without emotion. She knew the prices of iron and the prices of fish. She knew how much repairs cost at the capital's docks. She knew how much Hafenrest could knock off the price and still come out ahead. Halls tried to pressure her at first. Then he stopped. Then he began to respect her. By evening, the contract was signed. Randall drafted it on paper. The Hafenrest seal. Round. Bronze. Torin had cast it a week ago based on Yuna's design. It and 2 crossed oars. A simple design, but the seal made the document authentic. Halls left. The iron arrived 2 weeks later. 20 ingots. Ethan picked one up and nearly dropped it. Not because of the weight, because of the quality. Soft. Malleable. Pure. You could make real tools out of this iron. Real nails. Real hinges and staples. And other things as well. Ethan looked at Torin. Torin looked at the ingot. Then at Ethan. He understood without words. Ethan nodded. They began making weapons. Not swords. Not guns. Boarding hooks. Knives. Spearheads. Simple weapons that a fisherman could pick up and figure out in 5 minutes. Ethan didn't want war, but war might want him. And when it came, his men had to be armed with iron, not sticks. A bad event came a week after a good one. A lookout came running from the post on the eastern cape. No smoke. Run! A boy of about 16 whom Vance had trained to run the trails. A sail. No. Sails. 5. No. 7. 7 ships in formation from the east. Ethan went cold. 7 ships. This wasn't a reconnaissance mission. This wasn't a raid. It's Tice. For real. He'd dropped everything and run to the Cape. He'd run for the first time. Not a brisk walk, a full-out run. At the Cape he saw them. 7 ships, 2 brigs, 5 sloops, sailing in formation. In a crescent. A classic formation for an encirclement. Tice wasn't going to repeat his mistake. He wasn't going to chase the sloops over the reefs. He was moving across a wide front to cut off all escape routes. Ethan had counted 10 sloops, 1 schooner, a second one still under construction, 40 men capable of fighting. 10 of them were former sailors. The rest were fishermen. Against 7 gunboats and 200 pirates. The odds were hopeless. Ethan stood on the cape and watched the approaching fleet. Mayrie stood beside him. Her face was pale. She knew those ships. She knew their captains. She knew Tice. She said quietly that the flagship was the brig Black Tide. Tice was on board in person. He had come himself. That meant it was the end. Ethan looked at her. He said it wasn't the end. It was a challenge. And every challenge has a solution. Mayrie looked at him as if he were mad. Then she nodded. Madness it is then. Ethan climbed down from the cape and in 20 minutes devised a plan. Not perfect, but the only one possible. He wouldn't go out to sea. 10 boats against 7 ships in open water is suicide. He would defend the cove, a narrow passage between the cliffs. A single boat could block it. But Tice isn't a fool. He'll land his men on the shore and attack from land. So he'd have to hold both the entrance to the cove and the shore at the same time. He divided his men. Mayrie is in the bay at the entrance with 3 dinghies. If anyone tries to enter the passage, she'll meet them. Drake is on the southern shore with 20 men. That's the most likely landing point. Ethan is on the western cape with 10 men. They're the reserve. The women, children, and those unable to fight are heading up. Into the forest beyond the hills. With a 3-day supply of water and food. Una is with them. Una didn't want to leave. She stood there with the tag around her neck, staring at Ethan and refusing to move. Ethan crouched down in front of her, looked her in the eyes, told her he needed her to be up there. Not because she wasn't important, because she was the most important. If he died, Una was the only one who knew all the numbers, all the names. Everything needed for the island to function without him. She had to survive, no matter what. Una looked at him. Then she nodded. She turned and walked up the trail, without looking back. A small figure with a wooden tag around her neck, disappearing into the forest. Ethan watched her go and thought that if he died today, it would be the second time. And that dying a second time would be more painful, because now he had something to lose. From Ethan ran along the trail from the cape to the cove, reworking his plan as he went. 2 sloops from the north, 5 ships from the south. Thace isn't an idiot. He's sending 2 sloops around to land men on the northern shore and strike the settlement from the rear while the main force holds the front. A classic pincer movement. Ethan ran to the cove and shouted to Drake. He told him to take 10 men and head north, to the northern shore. They'll land there. Don't let them climb the hill. Drake didn't ask for clarification. He grabbed an axe and ran. His 10 men followed him. Ethan turned to the rest. 15 men, with spears, knives, and boarding hooks, against 5 ships from the south and 2 from the north. He positioned them along the southern shore behind the rocks. He said one thing. He said they were not to go out into the open. They were to hide behind the rocks. If the pirates landed, they were to wait until the pirates came ashore. Then they would strike from above, from the rocks. Not head-on. Not in formation. Like hunters, not like soldiers. The fishermen understood. They'd been hunters their whole lives. A crash rang out from the south, a cannon shot. The cannonball struck the cliff above the cove and shattered into stone dust. Tice was zeroing in, not on the boats, on the cliffs. He wanted to bring down rocks onto the entrance to the cove and trap them inside. Ethan cursed. Not in the local language, in English, loudly. A fisherman standing nearby looked at him with interest. A second shot. The cannonball struck closer to the entrance. Rocks rained down. Not many, but the entrance was narrowing. A third, a fourth. Tice methodically shelled the cliffs above the passage. An hour later, the entrance to the cove was a third narrower. Another hour, and the boats wouldn't be able to get out. Ethan shouted to Mayrie, "Get the boats out, now! All of them! If they're trapped in the cove, it's over." Mayrie didn't argue. 3 dinghies, one after another, passed through the narrowing passage and emerged into open water south of the cove. Ethan guided 4 more out after them. 7 boats. He left 3 in the cove with the people who didn't know how to steer. He left the quiet Selina alone. The schooner was too big for a battle in shallow water. 7 boats headed out to sea, and Ethan spotted 5 pirate ships half a mile ahead of him. 2 brigs and 3 sloops. They ceased firing when they saw the boats. Ethan led the dinghies along the reef ridge, not out to the open sea, but along the coast through the shallows, where large ships could not follow. The pirates saw 7 small boats gliding between the rocks and could do nothing about it. Their cannons couldn't reach them. The sloops couldn't navigate the shallows. Ethan steered them toward the northern tip of the island, where Tice's 2 sloops were supposed to land their troops. He was moving faster than the pirate ships because he was taking a direct route through the shallows while they were skirting the reef ridge. When he rounded the northern cape, he saw the scene. 2 sloops were anchored off the shore. 3 rowboats had been launched. There were people in them, about 40 men. The first ones were already on shore. Drake and his 10 men met them on the rocks. The fight had been going on for about 10 minutes. Ethan saw bodies on the rocks. He couldn't tell whose they were. Drake was fighting like a demon. His axe flashed, and every swing left a mark. But it was 10 against 40. The odds were stacked against them. Ethan maneuvered 7 rowboats up alongside the pirate skiffs from the side, where they weren't expecting it. The fishermen in the boats hurled grappling hooks at the skiffs. They hooked them. They pulled. 2 skiffs capsized, men in the water. A third skiff broke free and tried to escape toward the mothership. Mayrie cut it off with the mira and rammed her bow into the side. The skiff sprang a leak and began to sink. The pirates on shore looked back. They saw that their retreat was cut off. Their skiffs were either capsized or sinking. 7 boats full of Ethan's men were behind them. Drake, axe in hand, stood before them. Rocks loomed on both sides. They were trapped. One of the pirates dropped his weapon. Then a second. A third. Within a minute, all but one had dropped their weapons. A tall man with a scar across his entire face. He stood with a sword in his hand and looked at Ethan. Then he spat on the rocks. He thrust the sword into the sand and sat down. Ethan stepped ashore. He counted. 38 prisoners, 6 wounded. 2 dead. Not his men, the pirates. His losses, 3 of Drake's men wounded, 1 seriously. Drake himself was unharmed. Cuts on his hands, nothing serious. He was standing on the rocks with a bloodied axe, breathing heavily. Ethan walked up to him, told him he'd held his own well. Drake looked at him, spit out some blood, replied that next time Ethan should warn him in advance when he decides to come to the rescue, not when he's already almost been hacked to pieces. Ethan nodded. He got the message. 2 of Tice's sloops saw that the landing party had failed. One of them began to turn away. The second hesitated. Ethan looked at it. There was no Tice flag on that sloop's mast. A white pennant, not a sign of surrender. Negotiations. A rowboat was lowered from the sloop. There was 1 man in it. He rowed slowly toward the shore. Ethan waited. The man stepped ashore. Short, lean, about 45 years old, with a short gray beard and calm eyes. He didn't look like a pirate. He looked like a captain, a real captain. The man introduced himself. He said his name was Gregor Malt, that he was the captain of the sloop Grey Wind, that he had been serving Tice for 3 years against his will, and that he wanted to talk. Ethan looked at Mayrie. She was standing nearby looking at Malt. She nodded. She knew him. She said quietly that Malt wasn't one of the scoundrels. He was one of those who'd been forced into it. Ethan turned to Malt. He said, "Speak." Malt spoke briefly. Thais had arrived with 7 ships, but only 2 crews were truly loyal to him. The other 5 follow him out of fear. Because Thais has a reputation for sinking those who refuse him, Malt proposed a deal. He and 2 other captains are ready to switch sides to Hafenrest if Ethan accepts their men. 3 ships, 90 men. Ethan listened. He thought. 3 ships out of 7 is half of Thais's force. If they left, Thaisa would be left with 4 ships. Against 10 schooners and 2 schooners in the reef-strewn shallows, that was no longer an advantage. But taking in 90 former pirates was a risk. A huge risk. He could gain allies. Or he could end up with a Trojan horse. He looked at Malt. For a long time. Then he asked one thing. He asked why Malt wanted this. Malt answered simply. He said he was 45 years old. That he was tired of plundering. That he had 20 men on board who wanted to live, not die in foreign waters. That he'd heard of Hafenrest, about the ships that sail against the wind, about a port where no one is killed or robbed. He wants to go there, not as a pirate, but as the captain of a merchant ship. Ethan looked at him and saw what he saw in the eyes of every person who came to this island. Weariness. Not physical, but emotional. The weariness of a man who's tired of being someone he doesn't want to be. He held out his hand. Malt shook it. The deal was done. Thais learned of the betrayal an hour later. 3 of his sloops hoisted white pennants and broke ranks. They turned around and headed for the shore of Hafenrest. Thais was left with 4 ships, 2 brigs and 2 sloops, facing an island that had just doubled its forces. Ethan stood on the cape and looked out at black tide. Thais's brig was drifting half a mile away. Ethan could almost make out a figure on the bridge, tall and motionless. Thais was looking at him. They stood like that for a long time, a minute, 2. Then the black tide hoisted its sails, turned around, and headed east, with the 4 ships following behind. Ethan stood there, watched as the sails grew smaller. Selena stood nearby. Mayrie, Hannah, Drake, with his blood-stained axe. Una, who had run down from the hill when she saw that the battle was over. And Isla, who was already dragging a pot of soup toward the shore because people were hungry after the battle. Ethan turned to them. He looked at each one in turn. Then he said that they now had 13 ships, 10 sloops and 3 rowboats, and 430 men, and that Thais would return. And that by then, they needed to be ready, not for defense, but so that he would have nothing to take from them. Because the only way to defeat a pirate for good is to become so strong that it becomes more expensive to rob you than to trade with you. Mayrie murmured. She said it sounded beautiful. A month had passed since Thais's retreat. Hafenrest was growing so fast that Ethan couldn't keep track. 430 people had become 600 in 3 weeks. Rumors that the pirate fleet had retreated from the small island spread across the archipelago like wildfire. Fishermen came with their families, with their children, with goats, with sacks of grain, with everything they could carry. They weren't fleeing to Ethan. They were fleeing from the world that had cast them out. Hafenrest was the first place in many years that spoke one simple word: welcome. Ethan watched this stream of people and thought of 2 things at once. First, every new person is a mouth to feed. Second, every new person is a pair of hands that can work. The balance between the first and the second determined whether the island would survive or drown. He put Selena in charge of resettlement. She handled it. She divided the settlement into districts: the shipyard, the residential area, the shopping district, and the warehouses at the pier. Every newcomer was assigned work on their very first day. Not tomorrow, today. A person who works from day 1 feels like they belong. A person who sits around waiting feels like a burden. And those who feel like they don't belong start stealing, or fighting, or both. Ethan laid the keel of the second schooner on slipway number 1. Hannah Ryu oversaw the construction. Ethan gave her the slipway and told her to build it. Hannah looked at him. She asked if he really trusted her with an entire ship. Ethan replied that he didn't trust her. He trusted her hands. Hands don't lie. Hannah didn't smile, but her chin lifted a degree higher. She began to build. And she built in a way Ethan had never seen before. faster than he did, more precisely than Garen, with an intuition that can't be learned, one that's innate. 3 weeks later, the second schooner stood on the slipway, and Ethan walked around it and didn't find a single joint he'd want to redo. Not a single one. He turned to Hannah and told her that, as of that day, she was the head builder of Slipway number 2. Officially. Hannah opened her mouth, closed it. Then she said she was 20 years old and that no one would listen to a 20-year-old girl. Ethan replied that they would, because he'd tell them to, and if anyone told her something like she should go make soup, Ethan would personally explain to that person the difference between an opinion and a mistake. The explanation would be short and to the point. The first such conversation happened 2 days later. A fisherman among the new arrivals refused to follow Hannah's instructions on the slipway. He said he wasn't going to listen to some snotty-nosed kid. Ethan walked over. He stood in front of him. He didn't say a word. He just stood there. The fisherman was a head taller, broader in the shoulders. But Ethan looked at him the way a sergeant looks at a private who's just done something unimaginably stupid. Calmly, without anger, with that special kind of patience that's more terrifying than any shout. The fisherman was the first to lower his gaze. He mumbled that he understood. He went back to work. No one ever said anything like that to Hannah again. His 6th month on the island. The 1-year mark was approaching, and Ethan was starting to think on a larger scale. Centerboard boats were good for fishing and coastal sailing. Schooners were for trade. But for what he had in mind next, he needed something else. A school. Not a school with desks and textbooks. A school of navigation and seafaring. A place where fishermen become sailors and sailors become captains. He started small. Every evening after work at the shipyard, he gathered 10 people on the shore, young men aged 16 to 25, and taught them knots, the compass, the stars, currents, winds, how to handle the sails in different conditions, what to do during a sudden squall, how to determine the distance to shore by the height of the trees, how to repair the rudder on the open sea using whatever materials were at hand. Mayri helped. She taught navigation. Ethan taught everything else. They argued every evening about their methods. Mayri believed that a navigator must first learn the stars. Ethan believed one must first learn the sea. They shouted at each other by the campfire while the students sat and listened, taking it all in. After 2 weeks, Ethan realized that their arguments were the best part of the training. Because the students saw that the 2 people who knew the sea better than anyone else on the island disagreed with each other. And that meant the sea wasn't just a set of rules. It's questions you have to find the answers to yourself. Mayri realized this too. She stopped shouting. She began to argue more quietly, but with greater passion. Ethan assigned Vance and Kurt to train the harbor defense unit, 20 men, the basics of formation, the basics of boarding, handling spears and boarding hooks. Ethan wasn't turning them into soldiers. He was turning them into disciplined people who knew their place and wouldn't run at the first shout. Vance turned out to be a natural instructor. Quiet, patient. He'd repeat the same movement 20 times without getting irritated. Kurt was worse. Hot-headed, impatient. But he was respected because he'd fought pirates on the northern coast and survived. That was worth any amount of patience. Captain Malt and his men settled into Hoffenrest faster than Ethan had expected. Malt turned out to be exactly what he seemed, a quiet professional. He knew the sea. He knew ships. He knew people. The 8th month brought Everin Cast. She arrived in a sloop flying a merchant flag, accompanied by 2 sailors, and introduced herself as a trade agent from the capital. Tall. Dark hair pulled back into a bun. Her eyes were gray, cold, and watchful. She moved like someone who knew where her knife was and how quickly to draw it. Ethan saw through her on the 2nd day, not by her mannerisms, but by her hands. Trade agents don't have calluses from a hilt at the base of their thumb. Such calluses belong to people who train with a blade every day. He didn't expose her. Instead, he approached her that evening while she was sitting on the pier, jotting down notes in a small notebook. He sat down beside her. They were silent for a moment. Then he said that if she was going to write a report to the capital, she should write the truth. The whole truth. Because the truth is the only thing that can stop the war. Everin froze, the notebook in her hands, the pen hovering over the paper. She didn't turn around. She asked what made him think she was writing a report. Ethan replied that trade agents don't write in code, and she was writing in code. He'd seen it from 3 paces away. He hadn't read it, but he'd seen it. Everin slowly closed the book. She turned to face him. She looked at him for a long time. Then she asked what he wanted. Ethan replied that he wanted her to look at the island. For real. Not like a spy looking for weaknesses, like a person capable of seeing what's happening here. And what's happening is simple. 600 people who've been cast out of their lives are building a new one. Without war, without bloodshed, without rebellion. If the capital sees this and realizes that Havenrest isn't a threat, but an opportunity, there won't be a war. If it doesn't see it, there will be. And in that war, people on both sides will die. Everin listened. Her expression didn't change. A professional mask. Ethan had seen masks like that during interrogations. They mean nothing. What matters is what lies behind them. He stood up and left. Let her think. Everin thought for a week. She walked around the island. She looked. The shipyard, the school, the blacksmith shop, the smokehouse, the vegetable patches, children playing on the shore, fishermen returning with their catch, women sewing sails, old men mending nets. She saw a place that was functioning, not perfectly, noisy, dirty, chaotic, but it was functioning. And the people there weren't just surviving, they lived. On the 7th day, she went to see Ethan at the shipyard. She stood beside him and watched as he planed a bulkhead. Then she said he was right, that she was a lieutenant in Royal Intelligence, that she'd been sent to assess the scale of the threat and, if possible, neutralize the ringleader. That is, him. Ethan didn't stop working. He asked, "And what is the scale of the threat?" Everin paused. Then she replied that there was no threat. There's a port. There's a shipyard. There are 600 people who want to live. If that's a threat, then the Crown is fighting the wrong enemy. Ethan looked up. He looked at her. He asked if she would write that down. Everin replied that she would. But that wasn't enough. A single report from a single lieutenant wouldn't stop the Council of Great Families. More is needed. Ethan asked what exactly. Everin replied. She needs proof. Trade agreements, numbers, volumes, tax records. Anything that will show the Council that Havenrest is a more profitable partner than an enemy. Money. The Council understands only money. Ethan turned and called out to Yuna. Yuna came running a minute later with a tag around her neck and a wax tablet in her hands. Ethan told her to bring Selena. Yuna ran off. Selena arrived 10 minutes later with an account book. Ethan introduced them. Selena and Everin looked at each other. 2 women from the same world, the world of the great families, the royal court, and the subtle games where the loser risks not money but their life. They understood each other instantly, without words. Selena opened the book and began pointing out the figures. Everin read them. Her eyebrows rose higher and higher. In 8 months, Havenrest had generated more trade than some of the Crown's smaller ports did in a year, at 0 cost to the treasury, with a 5% duty that went toward the island's development, with a growing influx of merchants. Everin closed the ledger. She looked at Ethan. She said that this changed the situation. If the Crown sees these figures, at least part of the Council will have second thoughts. Not everyone. House Wyland won't have second thoughts because, to them, Havenrest is a personal enemy. But 3 of the 6 families might waver, if they see the money. Ethan nodded. He asked Everin if she would stay, not as a spy, but as a mediator. As a bridge between Havenrest and those in the capital who are capable of thinking. Everin thought about it for 3 days. Then she came and said she would stay, but on one condition. She wants a real job, not a cover, a job. Ethan put her in command of the 1st Reconnaissance Division, 4 schooners, 60 men. The mission, patrolling the outer approaches to the archipelago, reconnaissance of routes, establishing contact with friendly islands. Everin accepted. Her eyes lit up. For the first time since she'd arrived on the island, she looked alive. Not like an agent, like an officer who'd been given command. A real one. Not a soft assignment for a woman. A combat assignment. Ethan ordered an officer's greatcoat for her. They sat at the map that night and came up with insignia. Everin wanted an anchor. Ethan suggested an anchor and a quill, a symbol that reconnaissance is not just about the sword, but also the mind. Everin looked at him. She smiled for the first time, briefly, almost imperceptibly, but she smiled. The 9th month. Hafenrest was growing. 800 people, 12 schooners in the water, 3 Malta sloops, 10 rowboats. The pier had been expanded to 4 berths, a warehouse with a capacity of 300 metric tons, a shipyard with 4 full-scale slipways. Merchants came by every week, not just one, but 2 or 3 at a time. Word of the port with low duties had reached Valancourt. The first Valancourt merchant ship called at Hafenrest, and its captain was so astonished by what he saw that he sat with Isla for 3 hours, questioning everyone who approached. Renard, who now came twice a month, told Ethan that people in the capital were starting to get nervous. The great families are hearing about Hafenrest. So far, only through hearing about it. Soon they'll start taking action. Ethan knew this. Time was running out. It always was. He worked 18 hours a day and could feel his body giving out. It wasn't someone else's anymore. In 9 months, it had become his own. The calluses on his hands were his calluses. The pain in his back was his pain. The scars from splinters and burns from the forge were his scars. But the body was tired. He'd started coughing at night. Not badly, but he'd started. Selina was the first to notice. She came to him in the morning and said he looked like a man who needed to be tied to bed for 3 days. Ethan replied that in 3 days, Hafenrest wouldn't collapse while he was in bed, but it would falter. Selina replied that it wouldn't falter, because Garen knows the shipyard. Hannah knows the ships. Mayri knows the sea. Turan knows iron. Una knows numbers. Drake knows defense. Malt knows patrols. Everin knows intelligence, and Selina knows trade. And all of them together, that's Hafenrest. Not just him alone. Ethan looked at her. She was standing in the doorway, in a simple dress, with an account book under her arm, her back straight and her eyes calm. She was right. He was building this. People who could manage without him. That was exactly why he was building it, so that when he fell, everything would keep running. He lay down, slept for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he got up and went to the shipyard. The cough had gone away. Hafenrest was still standing. Nothing had collapsed. The 10th month. Winter had come to the archipelago with gray storms and short days. Ethan had been preparing for it since summer. 3 months' worth of smoked fish, grain in dry storage, rainwater cisterns full, firewood stockpiled, huts insulated with clay and moss. 800 people. Everyone under a roof, everyone with food. Not a single child was hungry. Ethan walked through the settlement every morning and counted the smoke coming from the chimneys. If a hut wasn't smoking, it meant something was wrong. Una walked with him. She counted along with him. She was 13 or 14. She never found out her exact age. Ethan designated the 15th day after her arrival at the shipyard, the afternoon he handed her the tag, as her day. That day became her day. Not her birthday, but hers. That winter, Selina found the edict. This is how it happened. Old Randall, her father's steward, was going through the documents Selina had brought with her into exile. Among them was a bundle of her father's letters, personal ones. Randall read them at Selina's request. In one of the last letters, old Lord Wayland wrote to his daughter that he had hidden something important in the monastery of St. Kira on the island of Vern, that she must find it if she ever found herself in the archipelago, that it changes everything. Selina showed the letter to Ethan. The two of them were sitting in her room, late in the evening, an oil lamp, shadows on the walls. Ethan read it. Then he reread it. Then he asked what kind of monastery it was. Selina replied that the monastery of St. Cyrus was the oldest in the archipelago, founded 800 years ago. It houses archives dating back to the earliest days of the crown. If her father had hidden something there, it would be something legal. Her father was a lawyer through and through, just like Randall. He wouldn't have hidden a family heirloom in a monastery. He would have hidden a document. Ethan organized an expedition. Quiet Selina, Mayri at the helm. Selina, Randall, and Ethan, 5 people. 2 days' sail to Vern Island. The monastery stood on a cliff overlooking the sea. Gray stone. Narrow windows. A bell tower without a bell. The monks greeted them warily but not hostile. The abbot, an old man named Brother Oswald, knew the name Wayland. He knew it and respected it. When Selina introduced herself and showed the family seal on her ring, the abbot turned pale. Then he nodded and led them to the archives, an underground vault. Dry, cold, shelves reaching to the ceiling, crammed with scrolls and books. Brother Oswald walked over to the far wall. He pushed a shelf aside. Behind it was a niche. In the niche was a chest. Small, made of iron, with a lock that opened with Selina's family ring. She inserted the ring. The lock clicked. Inside lay a scroll. Old. Very old. The parchment yellowed with age. A red wax seal. The royal seal. The first king. 800 years ago. Randall unrolled the scroll with hands that trembled with excitement and reverence. He read it aloud. Quietly. Slowly. Every word. The edict of the first king of the Asterian crown granted the Western Archipelago to the Wayland House as an eternal and inalienable possession. Not as a province of the crown. As a sovereign territory under the direct vassalage of the king. Bypassing parliament. Bypassing the great houses. Bypassing all subsequent laws. The edict was sealed with 4 seals. The king's, the Wayland houses, the monastery of St. Cyrus, and the archbishop's. 4 seals out of 4. The document was flawless. Randall finished reading. He raised his head. His eyes were wet. He said that this document meant one thing. The Western Archipelago had never legally been part of the crown. It had always belonged to the Wayland clan. When the dynasty changed 300 years ago, the new king simply forgot about this edict. Or perhaps he didn't forget. He hid it. Because the archipelago, with its trade routes, was too valuable to leave in the hands of a single family. The document had been lost on purpose. Selina stood motionless, the scroll in her hands. Her face was pale. She said nothing. Ethan looked at her and understood what was happening. They weren't rebels. They had never been rebels. Selina wasn't an outcast. She was the rightful owner of this land. Every island in the archipelago belonged to her by a right that was 800 years old. And those who had exiled her, those who had declared her dead, those who sent her to die, they didn't just betray a relative, they stole her kingdom from her. Selina raised her head. She looked at Ethan. She asked quietly. She asked, "What now?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought for a moment. Then he said, "We're not rebels anymore. We're home now. And we need 3 certified copies of this edict. 1 for us, 1 for the abbot, 1 for the Valancourt imperial ambassador. 3 copies in 3 different hands. It's impossible to destroy all 3. Randall began making copies that very day. Brother Oswald affixed the monastery seal to the first copy. Selina took the second one with her. The third had to be delivered to Valancourt. Ethan looked at Everin, who was waiting for them on quiet Selina. Everin nodded. She understood without words. She was a former intelligence officer. She knew how to deliver a document so that it would reach its destination. The return trip to Hoffenrest took a day and a half. Ethan stood at the bow of the schooner and gazed at the horizon. Selina stood beside him. She held the scroll in her hands and wouldn't let go. Then she spoke softly. She said that her father had known, he'd always known. He'd found this edict in the archives long before his death, and he'd hidden it, because he knew that if the great families found out, they'd kill him and her. They found out. They killed him. But they didn't find the edict, and now she had it. She had it. The woman they'd cast aside like trash. Her voice didn't tremble. It was steady and firm as steel. Ethan looked at her and, for the first time, saw not a victim, not a survivor, a queen. Not by title, by right, and by the core that didn't break when everything around her was falling apart. They returned to Hoffenrest. Ethan gathered his council. Selina, Garin, Hannah, Mary, Drake, Malt, Everin, Ayla, Una, Randall. 10 people in a cramped room. Selina read the edict aloud. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Drake snorted. He said that so, it turned out they weren't pirates but the rightful owners. Ethan replied. He said they were neither masters nor pirates. They were people living on their own land, and now they had a document confirming it. He said that from this day forward, he would no longer call himself captain. He was the guardian of the archipelago. Not a title, a position, one he could relinquish at any moment. The people in the room looked at him. Then Garen nodded. Malt followed suit. Then Hannah. Then Mayri. Then Drake. Everyone. Una wrote it down in her book. The date, the names, the decision. The first official document of the Free Archipelago. 1 year, 365 days since Ethan woke up on a rotten deck with salt water in his mouth. Hafenrest. 1,200 residents, 22 vessels in the fleet, schooners, dinghies. 3 former pirate sloops refitted as merchant ships. A shipyard with 4 full-scale slipways. A school. A blacksmith shop with 2 forges. Trade turnover from which Selena took a 5% cut, and that 5% was enough for everything. The first merchants from Valancura signed long-term contracts. Iron flowed in a steady stream. Bronze followed the iron. Copper followed the bronze. And after the copper came cloth, grain, spices, and everything that builds not mere survival, but life itself. Spring brought a clash with the Royal Patrol. A crowned frigate flying the Admiralty's flag entered the archipelago's waters and intercepted the Hafren's trading schooner. The frigate's captain, a young, haughty officer from a junior branch of one of the great families, demanded an inspection and the arrest of the crew as smugglers. Mayri was at the helm of the schooner. She did not obey. She did not flee. She simply replied that the schooner Quiet Celine was registered in the free port of Hafenrest under the commercial charter and was carrying a legal cargo. And she presented a trading license bearing the seal of Hafenrest. The frigate's captain did not know what to do. He had received orders to detain smugglers. Standing before him was a woman with documents who politely refused to comply. He aimed the cannons. Mayri didn't budge. She stood on the deck, arms crossed. The wind ruffled her hair. Behind her, 3 Everin schooners appeared on the horizon. A reconnaissance squadron. They were sailing in formation, fast. The frigate captain looked at the 3 schooners. He looked at Mayri. He looked at his cannons. He didn't fire. He turned around and left. Ethan found out about it 2 days later when Mayri returned. She recounted it calmly, as if it were an ordinary occurrence. Ethan listened and thought that this woman had grown from a navigator into a commander in 10 months, and that she was worth the navigational instruments he'd ordered for her from Torin. A sextant, a bronze chronometer, a set of charts with her name in the corner. He presented them to her publicly. In front of the entire crew, in front of the whole port. Mayri took the sextant in her hands and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Ethan. She didn't say anything, but there was no longer any trace of the contempt he'd seen in her eyes on the first day. There was something else. Something warm. Something she turned away from because she didn't know how to deal with it. News of the clash with the Royal Patrol reached the capital within a week. Panic broke out in the capital. Not among everyone, at the House of Wayland. They were the first to realize that Hafenrest was not a pirate's den that could be crushed, but a political reality that needed to be addressed. The Admiralty Council convened for an emergency session. The 3 great families demanded a military operation. The other 3 wavered. It was exactly what Everin had predicted. A split. Half of the council wanted war. Half was counting the money. Ethan was preparing. Not for war, for what would come after it. He laid the keel of the first real frigate on slipway number 1. Not for attack, so that when he was gone, the archipelago could defend itself. Hannah oversaw the construction. 20 meters long. 8 gun ports. The hull was based on the Valancourt blueprints she'd brought with her, refined by Ethan and Garen. It was their shared ship. 3 generations of master craftsmen. Hannah's knowledge from Valancourt. Garen's experience from the archipelago. Ethan's principles from the 21st century. The frigate took shape slowly. Every frame, every plank, every bolt counted. Torin worked around the clock in 2 shifts. Una kept track of every nail. Selena allocated funds from the trade fund. Mayri calculated the sail area. Everin ensured the safety of the construction site. Malt patrolled the approaches. All of Hafenrest was working on this ship, and everyone knew why. Amid the big tasks, smaller ones were carried out. Every evening, Ethan spent an hour at the school. He taught. 20 students now. The best of them were already commanding dinghies on their own. Vance became a maritime instructor. Kurt quit drinking for good after Ethan made him senior supervisor of all the Cape outposts. Responsibility turned out to be the best cure for the bottle. Olin built dinghies without Garen's supervision, and his boats were just as good. Drake commanded a 20-man harbor guard, and no one stole nails anymore. Even Vesna, a half-blind old woman, found her place. She sat at the shipyard gate and told the children stories about the sea, about ships, about a man who came from nowhere and taught the boats to sail against the wind. The stories were half made up, but the children listened. And through these stories, they learned why their island existed and why it was important. A year and 3 months later, Olgerd Taze returned, not with a fleet, alone, in a small rowboat, with a white flag. Ethan met him on the shore. Taze stepped onto the sand, tall, thin, his face weathered by the sea and time. His eyes were tired, not angry, just tired. They stood facing each other, two men who were supposed to be enemies. Taze spoke first. He said he hadn't come to fight. He'd come to look. He looked, he saw, and he realized he'd lost. Not a battle, a war. The war he'd started 10 years ago when he became a pirate. He'd wanted the same thing Ethan had achieved, a free archipelago, a place where fishermen wouldn't have their boats taken away. But Taze had taken a different path, the path of force, and that force had consumed him. He'd become the very thing he'd been running from. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. When Taze finished, Ethan made a proposal. A year and a half, 547 days. Ethan stood on the shipyard in a canvas shirt with rolled-up sleeves, planing the frigate's steering column with a plane. The shavings fell onto the deck, light in color and smelling of resin. The sun hung low over the water, bathing the bay in gold. Nearby, on the slipway, Hannah was working. She was shaping the stern contours with such precision that Garen shook his head, no longer out of surprise, but out of envy. Mayri sat on a crate with a map spread out on her lap, plotting the final route for the reconnaissance division. Una stood at the edge of the slipway with a logbook and a quill tucked behind her ear, silently counting as her lips moved. She was 14. She'd grown a head taller over the past year. Her apprentice tag hung around her neck on a new cord that Garen had braided for her. She slept with that tag every night, every single one. Selena sat at a table made of planed boards under the awning by the slipway. In front of her lay an account book, the third one this year. The first two were full. Randall had bound them and placed them on a shelf in the trading office next to a copy of the edict. Hafenrest's trade volume over the past 6 months had exceeded that of the 2 small ports of the Crown combined. Selena knew every figure, every contract, every name. Everin stood at the dock in an officer's coat with an anchor and a quill on the clasp. The 4 schooners of her division rocked against the quay, 60 men under her command. Men who, a month ago, had been fishermen, now marched in formation and knew the difference between reconnaissance and patrol. Everin had made them a team, a real one. Ayla was carrying a pot of soup across the shipyard. A big one, a heavy one. Her boys were running alongside her. The older one was carrying spoons. The younger one, bread. They'd grown up. They'd gotten a tan. They'd learned to sail that little boat Ethan had built for them. The little boat now sat at the dock next to the big ones, and Ayla no longer flinched when the boys set out in it for the cove. They were learning about the sea through joy, not fear. That was exactly what Ethan wanted. He was planning the steering column and thinking that the frigate would be ready in a month. 20 meters, 8 gun ports, a hull that united 3 schools of shipbuilding, 3 worlds. This ship would stand guard over the archipelago when Ethan was gone. Not tomorrow, not in a year, someday, because everyone dies. He had already died once and knew how it happened, quickly and without warning. The winch cable, a blow to the temple, darkness. He had to pass everything on in time, to Garen, to Hannah, to Mayri, to Torin, to Vens, to Una, to everyone, so that when he was gone, Hafenrest would live on. He worked, he built ships, he traded, he protected his own. Without him. That was his true goal. Not the fleet, not the port, not the frigate. People who could manage without him. The man who appeared at that moment interrupted his thoughts. A lookout came running from the eastern cape. A ship, a large one, a royal frigate, flying the admiral's pennant, heading straight for Hafenrest. Ethan set down his plane. Slowly, wiped his hands on his apron, looked at Selena. She was already standing, the ledger in her hands, her face calm. They both knew this day would come. A royal envoy, an ultimatum, or negotiations, or both. The frigate came into view an hour later. Huge. 3-masted, 40 gun ports, gold on the bow, the crown's flag on the mainmast. Next to it, the flag of the Council of Great Families. The envoy was not the captain. He was the envoy representing the entire crown. The frigate dropped anchor half a mile from the port. A launch was lowered. There were 8 men in it. One was in full dress uniform, gold on his epaulets, white gloves, a tricorn hat. He stepped onto the pier. He looked around. He saw the port. 30 schooners at the docks, a frigate on the slipway, a shipyard, warehouses, 1,200 men, flags without the royal coat of arms. His face grew tense. He had expected a barbarian camp. He saw the city. Small, but a city. They led him to the shipyard, not to the palace. There was no palace. To the shipyard, where a frigate stood on slipway number 1. And standing by the frigate was Ethan, in a canvas shirt, covered in wood shavings, with a plane in his hand. He didn't look up when the ambassador approached. He kept planing. Selena stood nearby, in a simple dress, with an account book. Hannah with a blueprint. Mayrie with a map. Una with a tag around her neck. Everin in an officer's coat. Isla with a bowl of soup. Everyone's here. Everyone's in their place. The ambassador cleared his throat. Ethan spoke without turning around. "Read your ultimatum, ambassador," he said. Just louder, he's working. The ambassador took out a scroll, unrolled it, began to read. His voice was well-trained, loud, accustomed to halls and auditoriums. The Council of the Great Families and His Majesty the King of the Asterian Crown hereby declare all settlements in the Western Archipelago to be illegal. All residents are ordered to lay down their arms and submit to the representatives of the Crown. All ships are subject to confiscation. All fortifications are to be demolished. The individual known as Ethan Cross is to be arrested and brought to the capital for trial. The Crown demands immediate surrender. The ambassador finished reading. He rolled up the scroll. He looked at Ethan. Ethan was planing wood. Shavings fell. Thin, light-colored, smelling of resin. Selena stepped forward, calmly, with her back straight. She opened the ledger. From the ledger she took out a scroll, an old one, yellowed, with 4 seals. She spoke in an even voice. She said that before the ambassador continued, he should familiarize himself with the edict of the first king from the year 800, a copy certified by the monastery of St. Cyrus. The original exists in 3 copies. She had one, with the abbot, and with the imperial ambassador Valancourt. The ambassador took the scroll. He read it. His expression changed as he read, from confidence to doubt, from doubt to understanding, and from understanding to pallor. He looked up. He looked at Selena. He looked at Ethan. Ethan finally put down the plane. He straightened up. He wiped his hands on his apron. He looked at the ambassador. Calmly, almost kindly, he said, "We are not rebels, ambassador. We are at home. Return to the capital and convey this. We are ready to talk, as equals." The ambassador stood there, the scroll in one hand, the ultimatum in the other. 2 documents, one several weeks old, the other 800 years old. 800 years always triumph over a few weeks. Always. The ambassador rolled up the edict, neatly. He handed it back to Celine. He bowed, briefly, not deeply, but he bowed. He turned and walked toward the rowboat. His entourage followed him. An hour later, the Crown's frigate weighed anchor and sailed east. Ethan stood on the pier and watched as the frigate's gilded bow grew smaller against the horizon. Standing beside him was his entire world. Selena, with the edict in her hands and fire in her eyes. Garen, with his weathered hands and youthful faith in the ships he had built. Hannah, who at 20 had become the archipelago's finest shipwright. Mayri, who read the stars like a book and no longer wore chains. Everin, in a cloak bearing an anchor and a quill, who had found on this island what she hadn't found in her entire career, a place where she was considered an equal. Drake, with a knife at his belt and his name on the side of his boat. Malt, with a gray beard and the quiet confidence of a man who finally serves a cause rather than fear. Ayla with a pot of soup, because after ultimatums, people are hungry. Yuna with a tag around her neck and a ledger in her hands. A 14-year-old girl who remembers everything and who, for the first time in her life, is being called by her name. Torin, in a blacksmith's apron, his hands scorched by the iron he transforms into ships. Vance and Kurt at their Cape outposts, peering out at the horizon. Randall at a table with pen and paper, recording the history they're writing every day. 1,200 people whom the world had cast aside, and who built their own. The 8 bells rang out. Ethan counted the chimes. 8. End of the watch. Beginning of a new one. The first new schooner was leaving the bay. White sails against the backdrop of the sunset sky. Heading south. A trade voyage to Valancourt. In the hold, smoked fish and lumber. On the bow was the name. Hathenrest. Not a person's name, a place's. Ethan looked at it and thought that it all began with a rotten deck and icy water splashing in his face. From a stranger's body and strange stars. From a woman with dry eyes and 3 men with clubs. From a scrap of parchment and a hairpin. And it led him right here. To a port of 1,000 people. To a fleet of 30 ships. To a frigate on the slipway. To an edict 800 years old. To the people standing beside it, watching the sunset and knowing that tomorrow will be a new day. And on that day, there will be work. And in that work, there will be meaning. Selena walked over and stood beside him. Close. Closer than usual. Their shoulders were almost touching. She didn't say a word. Neither did he. They stood and watched as the schooner bearing the name of their home sailed out to sea. Quiet Selena. Mira. Hannah one. Every ship has a name. Every name is a person. Every person is a story. Somewhere in the ocean beyond the horizon, Thaisa's little rowboat rocked on the waves. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the capital, an ambassador entered the council chamber with an edict in his hands, and his words were changing the balance of power. Somewhere on the island of Vern, Brother Oswald lit a candle before a copy of the document and prayed for the people he had helped. Somewhere on the mainland, Valancourt was reading trade agreements bearing the Hoffenrest seal and calculating how much money this new port would bring. Ethan didn't know what would happen next. A second war. A peace treaty. Recognition. Betrayal. New enemies. New allies. He didn't know. But he knew one thing. Whatever happened, Hoffenrest would stand. Not because he stood there. Because they stood there. All of them. Everyone in their place. Each with their own name. Each with what he had given them. Not ships. Not weapons. Not walls. Faith that what is broken can be mended. People, shores, destinies. He turned toward the shipyard. The plane lay on the slipway where he had left it. Shavings on the deck. The frigate waited, unfinished, like everything in this world. Ethan picked up the plane, ran it along the wood. Shavings fell, thin, light-colored. He smiled, and continued working.